The Work of Evil by William Croft Dickinson. Ever since his return to duty from his long illness, Maitland Allen, our keeper of printed books, had been singularly reluctant to grant any access to the special collections which were in his charge. So much so that the rare book room in the library had become well nigh as sacred and as difficult to enter as the secret courts of an Eastern harem. Thus, when he suddenly said to me, "Come and I'll show you the whole collection," I was taken completely by surprise. I had asked for an early Italian work by Aeneas Sylvius. The assistant at the library counter had disappeared with my form. Allen had come back with him. And now, strangely, I was to be shown the whole collection. Was this simply a piece of unexpected good fortune? Or had the man some ulterior purpose? I had noticed during the last 2 or 3 weeks that he had made a point of stopping to talk to me whenever we met in a room or corridor. Had he singled me out in some way from the rest of my colleagues? And if so, why? Everyone knew that his recent illness had made him a little queer. Opening a door marked "Staff Only," Allen led the way through a maze of book-lined passages until at last, passing a heavy steel door, we stopped before an inner iron grille. This he unlocked, and, stepping aside, he ushered me into the room. I glanced around with curiosity, but he gave me time for no more than a quick glance. "There they are," he said, pointing to one of the stacks. "An extraordinary collection, a frightening collection. Lucretia and Aurelius, which you want, happens to be in it, but it's very much of a stranger here. For the rest, I hate them." And his voice rose nervously, as if in emphasis. I walked over to the stack, but I noticed he did not accompany me. There, as I saw 2 long rows of beautiful bindings, I murmured something of my appreciation and delight. Reverently taking down one volume after another, I examined the bindings more closely. All were of rich leather, elaborately tooled in a variety of intricate patterns, in which whorls and strange cabalistic signs predominated. I also turned to the title pages. Every work was either an incunabulum or of a date early in the 16th century, but every work was on the same theme. I ran my eye along the shelves, picking out the volumes which bore titles on their spines. Still, the same thing. "Why," I exclaimed, turning towards him, "they're all on black magic and necromancy. What you might call a collection of evil, or, at any rate, a collection of evil intent. Who on earth gathered together all this devilry? It looks as though someone was striving hard to find something which at last would work." "An unfortunate young man whose history you know as well as I do," answered Allen slowly. "John, 3rd Earl of Gowrie. You may remember that after studying here he became a law student at Padua, and was there said to have dabbled in magic and witchcraft. Well, here's his library, or part of it, and I wish it had never survived." Again I noticed the nervous pitch in his voice. "Well," I replied lightly, "if he did dabble in the forbidden art, he must have found it pretty ineffective. The very number of his books shows that. One would have thought that constant experiment, followed by constant failure and disappointment, would have been bound to bring disillusion." For a full minute Allen made no reply. Instead, he gazed at me with an odd look in his eyes. "Ineffective," he said at last. "I wish to God you were right. Do you see that safe over there? It contains one further book belonging to Gowrie's collection. No one knows it's there but myself and, now, you. That book is the one book which at last Gowrie found would work. Listen to me. You must listen to me. And I'll tell you a tale of devilry that has tormented me ever since this collection came in. Then you'll believe in its effectiveness." He had pointed to a small safe in a corner of the room. I made a step towards it, but he seized me by the arm. Often I feel I must take the book in that safe and throw it into the middle of the sea, he continued, but I can't do it. I'm too afraid. Only one small book. Yet, it is evil itself. That one book seizes a man by the throat and strangles him to death. I looked at him in astonishment. Could it be Alan who was saying all this, and who was holding my arm so tightly that his fingers were biting into my flesh? Whatever do you mean? I asked, partly disturbed and partly angry at being held, as though I were a child faced with something which might be dangerous. I wish I knew, he replied slowly and in a quieter tone. All I can tell you is that within the last 18 months, 2 men have been strangled to death after looking into that book. That's all. I was dumbstruck, and not without reason. We stood there, tense and silent, like 2 conspirators surprised by something they couldn't name, and fearful of what it might mean. The collection came to us towards the end of the war, said Alan, breaking the silence at last. It came from the local antiquarian society, and it came in the wooden boxes in which it had been stored when Gowrie House was pulled down in 1805, and in which it had remained untouched until we opened those boxes in this very room, nearly 150 years later. It's said that the books were discovered in a wall closet which had been panelled in and so lost to sight. It may well be so. Perhaps Gowrie himself entombed them that way. Perhaps he, too, tried to rid himself of an evil incubus. Perhaps Gowrie put one particular book, with all its fellows, into a hidden closet, as I have put that one particular book into a safe. Perhaps he too was afraid to do the one thing he ought to have done. Or perhaps he did something else. Perhaps he put his own curse upon the book, that no one should again open its pages and live. That, at any rate, has been its history here. First, it was Fraser, who, you will remember, was our professor of chemistry before you came. As soon as the collection arrived, he was all agog to see it. Day after day he was here with his notebook, working out their formulae, he would say to me. Damned interesting, some of them. But one day he read too much. I had been in the read room that afternoon, and I didn't come here until nearly closing time. Fraser, as usual, was in his seat by the window, there. But that afternoon he didn't look up with his usual cheery nod. Instead, as he looked up at my entrance, I saw that his face was drawn and white. My God, Alan, he said in a strange voice, this book is the devil himself. It should be burned to ashes. He pushed his chair back and seemed to recover himself. Look, he continued, glaring at me with fierce earnestness, I'm putting it here in this empty case. Lock it in and let no one ever read it again. He strode to that wire-fronted case over there, it was empty then, thrust in the book and waited for me to lock the door with my master key. Then he pushed past me and went out. It was the last I ever saw of him. That same night he was found dead in his own room in the lab, strangled, and no one could explain how or why. He had a queer kind of lab coat of which he was very proud. It was like an old-fashioned smock, which was tied by a fancy cord running through the neck. When he was found, his hands were gripping that cord. It had been drawn so tight that it had throttled him. The students who had been working in the lab had seen no one go into his room or come out of it. I know now that they wouldn't see anyone. I know, too, that Fraser's hands were at that cord in a vain struggle to loosen it and live. No one thought of connecting Fraser's death with the book he'd been reading. At first, I hardly associated the two events myself, yet it was not long before I found I was growing frightened of that book, lying by itself in its locked case. I tried to avoid looking at it, but it seemed to force its presence upon me. Perhaps a fortnight passed before I realized the truth. Then, suddenly, I knew. I knew that Fraser's death had been caused by me. Frightened as I was, I still had courage enough to do one thing. Unknown to the rest of the staff, I removed from the library catalogue all the entries relating to it. Fraser's death should not go unheeded. No one should read that book again. No one should even know of its existence. Had I dared, I would have burned it, as Fraser had said it should have been burned. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Already it had me in its power. I was afraid of it. And so young Inglis had to die, the second victim. He had come to us as a part-time student assistant, and had quickly proved his worth. So much so that special tasks were soon assigned to him automatically, and at a time when I was unluckily absent for a few days with influenza, he was given the task of checking the shelf catalogue of the special collections. You can imagine my horror when, on the day of my return to duty, I found him here, holding the book in his hands, open and reading it. As soon as he saw me, he called out, "I found an incunabulum, which isn't in the catalogue. It's filthy with dust." But I rushed up and seized the thing from him. I shoved it back into the case and relocked the door, while he looked at me open-mouthed. But what could I say? I simply dare not tell him the truth. As I saw it, to tell him the truth would be to tell him his own sentence of death. I made some feeble excuse, which I know he didn't believe, and sent him off. Then I sat down, sick and faint. What could I do to save him? Nothing. He was doomed. The evil thing was upon him, and he could never escape. I cursed myself for my own cowardice. Why, at least, had I not warned him? Had the book so laid its spell upon me that I even feared the ridicule which might follow my warning? Poor beggar. He didn't escape. When the library was closing that night, one of the staff found that the automatic lift wouldn't work. Naturally, he assumed that someone on one of the floors had failed to shut the door properly, and he went to look. He found the door which wasn't shut. He also found Inglis. He was trapped by the outer door and, strangely, he was trapped by the neck. Almost as though he had entered the lift and then, as the door was sliding to, had put out his head to look at something. Stranger still, but only to those who didn't know what I knew. The poor fellow was dead. I tell you, the pressure of the outer doors on that lift is so light that you can hold them back easily with one hand, yet Inglis was dead. He had been throttled by the light pressure of a lift door. Fraser had been strangled on the day he had opened the book. So had Inglis. Can you wonder that same night I had what was called a nervous breakdown? I was away for over a year, and as you probably know, I have only been back for some 6 weeks or so. Surprisingly, I have kept my reason, though sometimes I'm not sure. Perhaps I am mad, or perhaps I am suffering from some delusion. Yet I was the only person who knew that Inglis had opened the book. I was the only person who knew that Inglis was doomed to die. And he did die, as Fraser had died. God forgive me, I should destroy the thing. But I daren't. I'm too afraid of it. Yet about a fortnight ago, the day I spoke to you in the upper hall, I was brave enough to move it out of the bookcase and to lock it away in that safe. You gave me the courage to do that, even though you didn't know you had done so. Now I'm afraid again. I feel it is laughing at me behind the steel door and biding its time. You must forgive me, but I had to tell you this. One day I too may be found strangled, and you at least will know the reason why. As you may imagine, I was not particularly pleased at having this extraordinary burden of knowledge so suddenly thrust upon me. Yet as I crossed the quad back to my own room, my thoughts ran in a different vein. Poor old Alan, I thought. No wonder he had a breakdown. No wonder he's queer. Fancy living with that on your mind all the time. Poor wretch, a victim to his own imagination, with a harmless book locked up in his safe, and fearing it as though it possessed all the malignant power of some genie in the Arabian Nights, and mortally afraid to do the one thing which would bring relief. But I did Alan an injustice. I had given my lecture the next morning and was talking to a student in my retiring room when Wallace, one of the lecturers in the Modern Languages department and Alan's next-door neighbour, opened the door and beckoned me outside. "Did you know Maitland Allen was dead?" he asked. "Dead?" I repeated. "Yes, apparently last night he was all worked up about something. Kept walking up and down his study saying in a loud voice, 'I will do it, I will do it,' and generally worrying his housekeeper out of her wits. Then suddenly, about 9 o'clock, she heard him go into the hall. Peeping round her door, she saw him put on a cap, his scarf and his overcoat and literally rush out of the house. By this time, thoroughly alarmed, she came to us. I did my best to calm her down, but she was so upset that in the end I offered to go back with her and wait up with her for Alan's return. He didn't come in until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. We heard him open the front door, and then, just when he'd shut it again, we heard him give a queer kind of strangled, choking cry. We rushed into the hall and saw him half hanging from the door and half sprawled on the rug in the hall. One end of his scarf had caught in the door as he had shut it, and when he had turned away, it had pulled tight round his neck and had trapped him. We opened the door at once and released him, but when we tried to help him to his feet again, we discovered to our horror that he was dead. I came over to tell you, for I believe he had taken quite a liking to you." But I was no longer listening. My thoughts were rushing madly towards one word which seemed to loom larger and larger, and the one word was strangled. Fraser, Inglis, Allen. Could it all be coincidence? Or could such things indeed be true? Naturally, the Procurator Fiscal conducted an inquiry into Alan's death. A boatman stated that Alan, whom he identified, had knocked him up about midnight and had asked to be rowed a full mile out to sea. At first he had demurred, for Alan had seemed fair demented, but an offer of £5 had seemingly settled the matter. He rowed Alan out to sea, and when he had told him that they were well beyond the full mile for which he had asked, Alan, to his utter surprise, had suddenly plucked a small book from his coat pocket and raised it with both hands above his head, and had hurled it down into the water with all his force. Then, said the boatman, it crouched him down in the boat as though he were afraid someone was going to hit him, and he stayed like that till I tied up again, when he jumped out of the boat and fair ran along the quay as if the devil himself was chasing him. The doctors were puzzled but unanimous. Despite the softness and natural elasticity of the scarf, they had been surprised to find a sharp mark around Alan's neck, but they were convinced he had died of shock. His heart, they said, was in poor condition. Any shock would probably be too much for it. And I alone knew what that shock would be. I alone knew what would flash through the poor wretch's mind when he felt that sudden, unexpected tightening of his scarf around his neck. So much I had written yesterday when my mind was free, but how different it is today. Today, all Alan's fear and dread are now my own. Today, at the close of the library committee, our librarian spoke casually as if of a matter of little importance. He had looked over the rare book room, he said, after Alan's death, and there he had found inside the safe a book that belonged to the Gowrie collection, but which, to his surprise, had no entry in the catalogue. Dazed and bewildered, I found my way back to my room, and, as I write this down, I am a prey to every wild imagining. Can it be that Alan, deranged and overwrought on that last fearful night, cast the wrong book away? How could he? It was the only book within the safe. Yet reason recoils from that other thought, that a book can return from the depths of the sea. Reason, How long can reason prevail against this fearful question that is now pulsing through my mind? Already our librarian has handled the book and opened it.
Everybody dies. Everybody dies. Isn't that so?
You've tried to get into a lot of trouble.
So that was a work of evil by William Croft Dickinson, and I took it from a collection called Dark Encounters, a collection of ghost stories, edited by Alistair Kerr. He's got a very useful introduction to this. I'm going to say something about how I got it first. So I recently bought this, recently been up to Scotland for a couple of weeks, and I got this in the bookshop in Kirkwall on the Orkneys, on the mainland of the Orkneys. Also with another collection of Scottish ghost stories, some of which I've got anyway, but it's a bit of a addiction really, buying collections of ghost stories in second-hand books and new books. I'd previously seen these books when I was in Edinburgh a month or two ago, and I didn't buy them, but there we were. So we really enjoyed Orkney, and we went in a lot of tombs, as you can imagine I would, crawling into my favourite one was Queen Hill, chambered cairn, which had no kind of Scottish heritage guards at it, so you were kind of able to do a bit more what you wanted. So you had to crawl. There's a passage, and you think this is like 5,000 years old, and it's immensely well made, and it's still flagged and everything. You would think it was perhaps made 4 years ago. I'm going to tell you something. I don't want you to tell Scottish heritage, okay? So we went in, and I went in on my hands and knees, and then in the middle you could stand up, and then there's little side chambers where they put the dead, these Stone Age people. And also found with them were something like 24 skulls of dogs. So the board outside, so I've got to say something in favour of Scottish heritage. I'd say mostly things in favour of them, really. But we had a bit of an officious guard at Skara Brae. That's the only reason I'm saying this. But in general, they look after their stuff. It was really fantastic. It was well interpreted. We went on the Maze How tour as well. That was great. Of course, the rings of Brodgar and Stenness stones. There's tons of stuff on Orkney. It's a fantastic place. Sheila said to me, I think we've left a bit of our heart in Orkney, and I think that's true. So anyway, so queuing, going back to the tombs of the dog people, which I know you're particularly interested in. And this is the bit I don't want you to tell Scottish heritage. We had our dogs with us, and I said, do you think the dog people, because probably they loved dogs, it was their totem animal, would like the dogs? So me and the dogs went back in the dark, and they were they had a good old sniff around. And I just, you imagine things, or do you? But I had this feeling that they were really pleased to see the dogs there. They didn't do any harm, and we left. So, and then there was a tomb which is closed at the moment on South Ronaldsay. We stayed in St Margaret's Hope, which is a beautiful little village, and it surrounding its own harbour. It's really gorgeous. And there was a tomb of the sea eagles on the south coast of South Ronaldsay, which was closed, but the people there had been buried with the talons of sea eagles. Probably that was their totem animal. So that was very interesting, and nothing to do with this other than I got this book on a trip to the Orkneys. Let me say something about him. So William Croft Dickinson, who Alistair Kerr says, for serious students and aficionados of Scottish history, William Croft Dickinson needs no introduction. He was born in 1897 and died in 1963. He was arguably the most distinguished 20th century history of Scotland. As John Imrie recalled in his 1966 memoir, Dickinson was the author, co-author or editor of many books on Scottish history, including A New History of Scotland. He edited for publication a large number of primary sources, etc., etc., but he also wrote ghost stories. He was Scottish Records Advisory Council trustee at the National Library of Scotland, a member of the former Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland, so he maybe wouldn't have been that impressed by me letting the dogs go in the tomb. He was a first-rate university administrator, brilliant academic, accomplished lecturer and raconteur, also a man of action. He had his MA degree course in 1915, but he didn't graduate with a first in history and a medal in modern history until 1921. The First World War interrupted his studies at St Andrews. In 1916 he volunteered for service with the Royal Highland Regiment, usually known as the Black Watch. He was later commissioned in the Machine Gun Corps, and he won the Military Cross for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty in an action near Wipers, as they used to call it, Ypres, in 1917. 1917. Dickinson remained something of the old soldier thereafter, and he attributed his formidable organisational and administrative skills to his army training. Most of his students found him a sympathetic and even inspirational teacher. He was especially friendly to former servicemen, many of whom he taught after the Second World War. The introduction does not avoid scandal because, apart from he played golf and everything like that, it says his English nonconformist upbringing had influenced him to take a perceptibly Protestant partisan approach to some historical topics, including the Scottish Reformation. He had adapted happily to the Church of Scotland and became extremely knowledgeable about Scottish church history, editing John Knox's History of the Reformation in Scotland, but he lectured pungently and with verve, but reportedly there was once a walkout by Roman Catholic students in protest at some of his remarks. I don't know, certainly even where I was brought up just over the border in England, in Cumberland, there was a definite split between Catholics and Protestants. My biological father was Catholic, my mother's family were Methodists, and certainly even when we were at school, there were separate schools, and there were not punch-ups but tension at the bus stop where the Catholic school we were only little, and there were orange marches in Workington when I was growing up, and my friend Vernon, who was Catholic, used to shout at them from on his Saturday job at Marks and Spencer's out the window. So it was a real thing, and I'm joking there, but it was clearly very, very serious in certain parts of the British Isles and in Scotland and the overspill areas in the north of England as well. Things, we all used to know who was a Catholic and who was a Protestant. You just knew who was, and I don't think I do now. So things have changed. So it was a big deal. Anyway, let's get back to him. His first ghost story, published in Blackwood's magazine, seems to show empathy with the 17th century Covenanters, who were, extreme Protestants. Everybody's extreme or far something, aren't they, these days? But they were just, on the militant edge of Protestantism, and Scottish Episcopalians, who are Anglicans and Catholics, might not necessarily enjoy some of the empathy that Dickinson had with the Covenanters in that first magazine. The thing to say is he was an Englishman without any known Scots ancestry. He was born in Leicester, brought up in Yorkshire and educated at Mill Hill in London prior to his studies at St Andrews. He nevertheless knew far more about Scottish history than most Scots, so they say. I'm sure that may be true. Alistair Kerr then in his introduction talks about the history of writing ghost stories in Scotland, and he says that many of Scotland's finest authors have tried their hand at writing ghost stories. The Tapestry Chamber and Wandering Willie's Tale, there were Sir Walter Scott's, James Hogg, I've done both of those people, Mrs. Margaret Oliphant, author of The Open Door, which I want to do. It's a bit long, but it's one of the ones I want to do. There is a story called The Open Door by Charlotte Liddell, which I have done, but I want to do, it's a really good story, Mrs. Margaret Oliphant's The Open Door. Robert Louis Stevenson, of course, I've done a bunch of those. Arthur Conan Doyle, yes, I've done that. He was born in Edinburgh, albeit of Irish descent. John Buchan, I've done a few John Buchans. George Mackay Brown, an Orkney man, although his mother was from Sutherland, I remember reading. And Muriel Spark. Ian Rankin has done the Rebus novels. I'd love to do some of those, but I'd need permissions. So, what stimulated Dickinson to start writing ghost stories, Alistair Kerr asks. His timing may offer a clue. His first one, entitled The Professor's Ghost Story, appeared in Blackwood's magazine in 1947, 3 years after Dickinson had moved to Edinburgh, and it attracted favourable comment. 6 years later, in 1953, it was reissued under a new name, as the title story in a collection of 4 ghost stories, The Sweet Singers and 3 Other Remarkable Occurrences, published by Oliver and Boyd and illustrated with atmospheric engravings by Joan Hassel. And it was very well received, so probably that would encourage him to do it. You may know, if you've been to Edinburgh, that there is a bit of a ghost industry there, and there are lots of ghost walks, ghost tours you can go to. Is it Mary King's Close Underground? I've done them all, of course. There's the Edinburgh Dungeon near Waverley Station, and if you want a ghost, you could do a whole ghost weekend in Edinburgh, to be honest. And I've said elsewhere that my dad was brought up near the Greyfriars Kirkyard, and my uncle told me of he saw. My dad had. They told me separate stories. They weren't together, and they told me so. My dad had had something happen when he had a friend of his from the Royal Navy, a guy from Anglesey, a Welsh guy from Anglesey, was staying over, and something came through the wardrobe. I can't remember the exact details now. And my uncle Owen told me about how when he was in the house, he was 10 years younger than my dad, a ball of fire was seen, or sparks thing. So there you go. So Edinburgh, yes, absolutely, you can do this. Apparently the Dickinsons lived in Fairmile Head, which is way out of Edinburgh, really. It's on the edge of Edinburgh, isn't it? Where the crematorium is. So you've got to kind of compare M.R. James, who is the academic ghost story writer. This is a very... it's not James, is it? But, you know, it's very similar. The academics, the books, the ancient, the evil in ancient tomes. So it is a Jamesian style. Now, I'm not sure whether he actually acknowledged that James influenced him. But, you know, the similarities are obvious. So you can get this book. I'm not getting a cut out of it. I'm just saying it's if you're interested, if you like that. William Croft Dickinson, Dark Encounters, a collection of ghost stories introduced by Alistair Kerr. And I saw it in I tell you where I saw it, in the Scottish Storytelling Centre on the Royal Mile. I was in there. But you'd probably pick it at most bookshops in Scotland, certainly. And if you're not in Scotland, you can order it from your local bookstore, or if you really must, you can go get it from those evil people. I only say that because they banned me, but I stand by it. So it's in terms of the craft of it, it's relatively simple. It's sort of like a frame story in that we have our protagonist who's telling us in the first person. So that takes it back into sort of Henry James country and sort of late Victorian ghost stories. And Susan Hill has done pastiches of that as well in her more modern stories. Funny enough, there's something of the feel of Susan Hill in this for some reason. It's just occurred to me. But so our narrator, normally, except to say, with the frame stories, usually the person who's being told the story, who's listening to it by the person who's experienced it, i.e. Alan is the person who's experienced the hauntings, and our unnamed, I think, narrator hasn't. Usually, like in the Turn of the Screw, broadly speaking, there is they're not involved in the story at all. So usually in a frame story, in a gentleman's club or somewhere, or in a library, well, probably not, you don't talk in libraries, but the story is told to our first person, who is our named narrator here, and then he doesn't have anything to do with it. But in fact, the turn of this is the key sin. You remember I often talk about sins in horror stories. Somebody has committed a sin, because I'll say time and time again, the supernatural is used as a moral agent in most cases to punish wrongdoers and to right wrongs. And so the wrong is, this guy is a fervent Christian churchgoer, so he's not going to have a very favourable view at all about ancient grimoires, in that they could be anything other than the work of the devil. Although I think if you were to study them in a different light, you might not see them as particularly. Most of them were not satanic at all. They were alchemical and occult, yes, but talking about forbidden things that the church didn't want to talk about, but not necessarily, but certainly not satanic. I'm not saying there weren't any. I've never come across any. I haven't read a ton of grimoires. I've read one or two. Oh no, but I'm still here. So, but the point is, so the book itself is a MacGuffin, isn't it? In Hitchcockian terms, it is a plot token. It is the nexus of evil. If you read that, it's like The Ring, which is that one where they watch the video. Same idea. If you watch the video, you're going to die. If you open the book, you're going to die. There is a story about there was again a Scottish wizard called Michael Scott, and he may have been a wizard, but he was a learned man, and he went to Italy and all sorts, and he's supposed to come back and being credited with all sorts of magical effects, magical achievements, wonder working, devilish. He was accused of being devilish. Anyway, his book was supposed to hang on the wall of Woolsey Castle, which is now knocked down. It's in a farmer's field, but that was where the monks of Home Cultram, not Home St Cuthbert, that's different, that's just down the road. Home Cultram Abbey kept their library, and the book was so evil it was hung on an iron spike and nobody would dare read it. So this idea, and that's a very Scottish themed story, even though Home Cultram again is just over the border, where Robert the Bruce's father was buried. Didn't stop him burning it to the ground after Bannockburn though. But anyway, I digress. But so this idea of the evil book that's too evil and it will kill you, we can see echoes, can't we? I think the Necronomicon, Lovecraft's Necronomicon, of course, is the same idea. You don't die necessarily, but you go insane when you read the Necronomicon. But as I said, this folk tale of Michael Scott's book on the Iron Hook at Woolsey predates all of these, and then I'm sure there are some Henry James stories that are like this, not Henry James, M.R. James stories that are like this, but at the moment I'm having a mental blank. Put it in the comments. So yes, that is not remarkable really. It's good, it's creepy, it works, but it's not novel. No pun intended. It wasn't a novel. It's not fresh, you know. But I think if it had just been about like The Ring or the Necronomicon, really, you read it and something bad happens to you, that's one level of bad. But I do think he adds, William Croft Dickinson adds another level, which is guilt, which is the moral failing not to warn others. So that's Alan's problem there. And so I think the construction of the story is that it's not that reading the book killed him, it's that his guilt killed him. Do you see? And it's left open whether the book is actually a killer, or whether the Inglis and Fraser are killed are strangled by coincidence, some unpleasant coincidence. But it's never concluded. I think it's hinted that it is true, but I think it's strongly hinted that it's true. But it's still open. The door is still open. That it could just be a coincidence, because the issue is that our man Alan, he closes the door. He's a bit het up. He's put the book. Did he put the book? It's like the Screaming Skull stories. I've done Screaming Skull stories. The Screaming Skull appears in your house. If you move it, it will return. You can destroy it, but it will come back. So I also felt that was another trope. There's the evil book that if you read sends you mad, but there's also the returning evil item which you cannot destroy. So either, and how could he have made a mistake? So either the book is so evil and supernatural it's returned, and I think that's what Croft Dickinson's leading us to believe. But it's not that kills Fraser, it's his guilt that he didn't warn the other two men. And I think that just adds another ingredient to the story and lifts it above a simple story of a supernaturally evil object that kills you. It's the moral issue of, if you fail in your moral duty, that is what will kill you. And I think this ties in. This is a guy who was a devout churchman, and I think that ties in with him, strong sense of duty. Clearly this was a guy with a strong sense of duty. You know, he got a medal for gallantry in the First World War. This is a brave man who isn't going to hide. He's going to do what's right, and so he clearly has strong feelings about what's right. And Alan didn't do what was right, and it is that killed him, not the supernatural evil. That's what I think it is. So I hope you enjoyed that story, and I will be back soon. I'm not completely finished my travels. On tomorrow I've got to go down to Gloucestershire, to the Cotswolds, for a birthday party, and come back on Saturday. And then we're going to Whitby, and then I'm never going to go anywhere again. Well, I shouldn't say that, but I just want to rest from travelling. The Shadow in the Corner by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Wildheath Grange stood a little way back from the road, with a barren stretch of heath behind it, and a few tall fir trees with straggling wind-tossed heads for its only shelter. It was a lonely house on a lonely road, little better than a lane, leading across a desolate waste of sandy fields to the seashore. And it was a house that bore a bad name among the natives of the village of Holcroft, which was the nearest place where humanity might be found. It was a good old house, nevertheless, substantially built in the days when there was no stint of stone and timber, a good old grey stone house with many gables, deep window seats, and a wide staircase, long dark passages, hidden doors in queer corners, closets as large as some modern rooms, and cellars in which a company of soldiers might have lain perdu. This spacious old mansion was given over to rats and mice, loneliness, echoes, and the occupation of 3 elderly people. Michael Bascom, whose forebears had been landowners of importance in the neighbourhood, and his 2 servants, Daniel Skegg and his wife, who had served the owner of that grim old house ever since he left the university, where he had lived 15 years of his life, 5 as a student and 10 professor of natural science. At 33, Michael Bascom had seemed a middle-aged man. At 56, he looked and moved and spoke like an old man. During that interval of 23 years he had lived alone in Wildheath Grange, and the country people told each other that the house had made him what he was. This was a fanciful and superstitious notion on their part, doubtless, yet it would not have been difficult to have traced a certain affinity between the dull grey building and the man who lived in it. Both seemed alike remote from the common cares and interests of humanity. Both had an air of settled melancholy engendered by perpetual solitude. Both had the same faded complexion, the same look of slow decay. Yet, lonely as Michael Bascom's life was at Wildheath Grange, he would not on any account have altered its tenor. He had been glad to exchange the comparative seclusion of college rooms for the unbroken solitude of Wildheath. He was a fanatic in his love of scientific research, and his quiet days were filled to the brim with labours that seldom failed to interest and satisfy him. There were periods of depression, occasional moments of doubt when the goal towards which he strove seemed unattainable, and his spirit fainted within him. Happily, such times were rare with him. He had a dogged power of continuity which ought to have carried him to the highest pinnacle of achievement, and which, perhaps, might ultimately have won for him a grand name and a worldwide renown, but for a catastrophe which burdened the declining years of his harmless life with an unconquerable remorse. One autumn morning, when he had lived just 23 years at Wildheath, and had only lately begun to perceive that his faithful butler and body servant, who was middle-aged when he first employed him, was actually getting old, Mr. Bascom's breakfast meditations over the latest treatise on the atomic theory were interrupted by an abrupt demand from that very Daniel Skegg. The man was accustomed to wait upon his master in the most absolute silence, and his sudden breaking out into speech was almost as startling as if the bust of Socrates above the bookcase had burst into human language. "It's no use," said Daniel. "My missus must have a girl." What?" demanded Mr. Bascom, without taking his eyes from the line he had been reading. A girl to trot about and wash up and help the old lady. She's getting weak on her legs, poor soul. We've none of us grown younger in the last 20 years. 20 years, echoed Michael Bascom scornfully. What is 20 years in the formation of a strata? What even in the growth of an oak, the cooling of a volcano? Not much, perhaps, but it's apt to tell upon the bones of a human being. The manganese staining to be seen upon some skulls would certainly indicate, began the scientist dreamily. I wish my bones were only as free from rheumatics as they were 20 years ago, pursued Daniel testily, and then perhaps I should make light of 20 years. Howsoever, the long and the short of it is, my missus must have a girl. She can't go on trotting up and down these everlasting passages, and standing in that stony scullery year after year, just as if she were a young woman. She must have a girl to help. Let her have 20 girls, said Mr. Bascom, going back to his book. What's the use of talking like that, sir? 20 girls indeed. We shall have rare work to get one. Because the neighbourhood is sparsely populated, interrogated Mr. Bascom, still reading. No, sir, because this house is known to be haunted. Michael Bascom laid down his book and turned a look of grave reproach upon his servant. Skegg, he said in a severe voice, I thought you had lived long enough with me to be superior to any folly of that kind. I don't say that I believe in ghosts, answered Daniel in a semi-apologetic air, but the country people do. There's not a mortal among them that'll venture across our threshold after nightfall. Merely because Anthony Bascom, who had led a wild life in London and lost his money and land, came here broken-hearted and is supposed to have destroyed himself in this house, the only remnant of property that was left to him out of a fine estate. Supposed to have destroyed himself, cried Skegg. Why, the fact is as well known as the death of Queen Elizabeth or the Great Fire of London. Why, wasn't he buried at the crossroads between here and Holcroft? An idle tradition for which you could produce no substantial proof, retorted Mr. Bascom. I don't know about proof, but the country people believe it as firmly as they believe their gospel. If their faith in the gospel was a little stronger, they need not trouble themselves about Anthony Bascom. Well, grumbled Daniel, as he began to clear the table, a girl of some kind we must get, but she'll have to be a foreigner, or a girl that's hard driven for a place. When Daniel Skegg said a foreigner, he did not mean the native of some distant clime, but a girl who had not been born and bred at Holcroft. Daniel had been raised and reared in that insignificant hamlet, and small and dull as it was, he considered the world beyond it only margin. Michael Bascom was too deep in the atomic theory to give a second thought to the necessities of an old servant. Mrs. Skegg was an individual with whom he rarely came into contact. She lived, for the most part, in a gloomy region at the north end of the house, where she ruled over the solitude of a kitchen that looked like a cathedral and numerous offices of the scullery, larder, and pantry class, where she carried on a perpetual warfare with spiders and beetles, and wore her old life out in the labour of sweeping and scrubbing. She was a woman of severe aspect, dogmatic piety, and a bitter tongue. She was a good plain cook, and ministered diligently to her master's wants. He was not an epicure, but liked his life to be smooth and easy, and the equilibrium of his mental power would have been disturbed by a bad dinner. He heard no more about the proposed addition to his household for a space of 10 days, when Daniel Skegg again startled him amidst his studious repose by the abrupt announcement, I've got a girl. Oh, said Michael Bascom, have you? And he went on with his book. This time he was reading an essay on phosphorus and its functions in relation to the human brain. Yes, pursued Daniel in his usual grumbling tone. She was a waif and stray, or I shouldn't have got her. If she'd been a native, she'd never have come to us. I hope she's respectable, said Michael. Respectable? That's the only fault she has, poor thing. She's too good for the play. She's never been in service before, but she says she's willing to work, and I dare say my old woman will be able to break her in. Her father was a small tradesman at Yarmouth. He died a month ago and left this poor thing homeless. Mrs. Midge at Holcroft is her aunt, and she said to the girl, "Come and stay with me till you get a place." And the girl has been staying with Mrs. Midge for the last 3 weeks, trying to hear of a place. When Mrs. Midge heard that my missus wanted a girl to help, she thought it would be the very thing for her niece Maria. Luckily Maria had heard nothing about this house, so the poor innocent dropped me a curtsy and said she'd be thankful to come, and would do her best to learn her duty. She'd had an easy time of it with her father, who'd educated her above her station, like a fool as he was, growled Daniel. By your own account, I'm afraid you've made a bad bargain, said Michael. You don't want a young lady to clean kettles and pans. If she was a young duchess, my old woman would make her work, retorted Skegg decisively. And pray, where are you going to put this girl? Asked Mr. Bascom, rather irritably. I can't have a strange young woman tramping up and down the passages outside my room. You know what a wretched sleeper I am, Skegg. A mouse behind the wainscot is enough to wake me. I've thought of that, answered the butler, with his look of ineffable wisdom. I'm not going to put her on your floor. She's to sleep in the attics. Which one? The big one at the north end of the house. That's the only ceiling that doesn't let water. She might as well sleep in a shower bath as in any of the other attics. The room at the north end, repeated Mr. Bascom thoughtfully. Isn't that... Of course it is, snapped Skegg, but she doesn't know anything about it. Mr. Bascom went back to his books and forgot all about the orphan from Yarmouth, until one morning, when entering his study, he was startled by the appearance of a strange girl in a neat black and white cotton gown, busy dusting the volumes which were stacked in blocks upon his spacious writing table, and doing it with such deft and careful hands that he had no inclination to be angry at this unwonted liberty. Old Mrs. Skegg had religiously refrained from all such dusting, on the plea that she did not wish to interfere with the master's ways. One of the master's ways, therefore, had been to inhale a good deal of dust in the course of his studies. The girl was a slim little thing, with a pale and somewhat old-fashioned face, flaxen hair braided under a neat muslin cap, a very fair complexion, and light blue eyes. They were the lightest blue eyes Michael Bascom had ever seen, but there was a sweetness and gentleness in their expression which atoned for their insipid colour. "Hope you don't object to my dusting your books, sir," she said, dropping a curtsy. She spoke with a quaint precision which struck Michael Bascom as a pretty thing in its way. "No, I don't object to cleanliness, so long as my books and papers are not disturbed. If you take a volume off my desk, replace it in the spot you took it from. That's all I ask." "I'll be very careful, sir." "When did you come here?" "Only this morning, sir." The student seated himself at his desk, and the girl withdrew, drifting out of the room as noiselessly as a flower blown across the threshold. Michael Bascom looked after her curiously. He had seen very little of youthful womanhood in his dry-as-dust career, and he wondered at this girl, as at a creature of a species hitherto unknown to him. How fairly and delicately she was fashioned. What a translucent skin! What soft and pleasing accents issued from those rose-tinted lips! A pretty thing, assuredly, this kitchen wench. A pity that in all this busy world there could be no better work found for her than the scouring of pots and pans. Absorbed in his consideration about dry bones, Mr. Bascom thought no more of the pale-faced handmaiden. He saw her no more about his rooms. Whatever work she did there was done early in the morning, before the scholars' breakfast. She had been a week in the house when he met her one day in the hall. He was struck by the change in her appearance. The girlish lips had lost their rosebud hue. The pale blue eyes had a frightened look, and there were dark rings round them, as in one whose nights had been sleepless or troubled by evil dreams. Michael Bascom was so startled by an undefinable look in the girl's face that, reserved as he was by habit and nature, he expanded so far as to ask her what ailed her. "There is something amiss, I'm sure," he said. "What is it?" "Nothing, sir," she faltered, looking still more scared at his question. "Indeed, it is nothing, or nothing worth troubling you about." "Nonsense. Do you suppose because I live among books I have no sympathy with my fellow creatures? Tell me what is wrong with you, child. You have been grieving about the father you have lately lost, I suppose." "No, sir, it's not that. I shall never leave off being sorry for that. It is a grief which will last me all my life." "What? There is something else, then?" asked Michael impatiently. "I see you're not happy here. Hard work does not suit you. I thought as much." "Oh, sir, please don't think that," cried the girl very earnestly. "Indeed, I'm glad to work, glad to be in service. It's only—" She faltered and broke down, the tears rolling slowly from her sorrowful eyes despite her effort to keep them back. "Only what?" cried Michael, growing angry. "The girl is full of secrets and mysteries. What do you mean, wench?" I know it's very foolish, sir, but I'm afraid of the room where I sleep." "Afraid? Why?" "Shall I tell you the truth, sir? Will you promise not to be angry?" "I will not be angry if you will only speak plainly, but you provoke me by these hesitations and suppressions." And please, sir, don't tell Mrs. Skegg that I've told you. She would scold me, or perhaps even send me away." "Mrs. Skegg shall not scold you. Go on, child." "You may not know the room where I sleep, sir. It's a large room at one end of the house, looking towards the sea. I can see the dark line of water from the window, and I wonder sometimes to think that that is the same ocean I used to see when I was a child at Yarmouth. It's very lonely, sir, at the top of the house. Mr. and Mrs. Skegg sleep in a little room near the kitchen, you know, sir, and I'm quite alone on the top floor. Skegg told me you had been educated in advance of your position in life, Maria. I should have thought the first effect of a good education would have been to make you superior to any foolish fancies about empty rooms. Oh, pray, sir, do not think it's any fault in my education. Father took such pains with me. He spared no expense in giving me as good an education as a tradesman's daughter need wish for. And he was a religious man, sir. He did not believe—" Here she paused, with a suppressed shudder. "In the spirits of the dead appearing to the living, since the days of miracles, when the ghost of Samuel appeared to Saul. He never put any foolish ideas into my head, sir. I hadn't a thought of fear when I first lay down to rest in the big lonely room upstairs." "Well, what then?" "But on the very first night," the girl went on breathlessly, "I felt weighed down in my sleep, as if there was some heavy burden laid upon my chest. It was not a bad dream, but it was a sense of trouble that followed me all through my sleep, and just at daybreak, it begins to be light a little after 6, I woke suddenly with the cold perspiration pouring down my face. I knew that there was something dreadful in the room." "What do you mean by something dreadful? Did you see anything?" "Not much, sir, but it froze the blood in my veins, and I knew it was this that had been following me and weighing upon me all through my sleep. In the corner, between the fireplace and the wardrobe, I saw a shadow, a dim, shapeless shadow, produced by an angle of the wardrobe, I dare say." "No, sir, I could see the shadow of the wardrobe, distinct and sharp, as if it had been painted on the wall. This shadow was in the corner, a strange, shapeless mass. Oh, if it had any shape at all, it seemed—" "What?" asked Michael eagerly. "The shape of a dead body, hanging against the wall." Michael Bascom grew strangely pale, yet he affected utter incredulity. "Poor child," he said kindly, "you have been fretting about your father until your nerves are in a weak state and you're full of fancies. A shadow in the corner indeed. Why, at daybreak every corner is full of shadows. My old coat flung upon a chair will make you as good a ghost as you need care to see. Oh, sir, I've tried to think it's my fancy, but I've had the same burden weighing me down every night. I've seen the same shadow every morning. But when broad daylight comes, can you not see what stuff your shadow is made of? No, sir. The shadow goes before it's broad daylight. Of course, just like other shadows. Come, get these silly notions out of your head, or you'll never do for the workaday world. I could easily speak to Mrs. Skegg and make her give you another room, if I wanted to encourage you in your folly, but that would be about the worst thing I could do for you. Besides, she tells me that all the other rooms on that floor are damp, and no doubt if she shifted you into one of them, you would discover another shadow in another corner, and get rheumatism into the bargain. No, my good girl, you must try to prove yourself the better for a superior education. I'll do my best, sir, Maria answered meekly, dropping the curtsy. Maria went back to the kitchen sorely depressed. It was a dreary life she led at Wildheath Grange. Dreary by day, awful by night, for the vague burden and the shapeless shadow, which seemed so slight a matter to the elderly scholar, were unspeakably terrible to her. Nobody had told her that the house was haunted, yet she walked about those echoing passages wrapped round with a cloud of fear. She had no pity from Daniel Skegg and his wife. Those two pious souls had made up their minds that the character of the house should be upheld, so far as Maria went. To her, as a foreigner, the Grange should be maintained to be an immaculate dwelling, tainted by no sulphurous blast from the underworld. A willing, biddable girl had become a necessary element in the existence of Mrs. Skegg. That girl had been found, and that girl must be kept. Any fancies of a supernatural character must be put down with a high hand. Ghosts indeed, cried the amiable Skegg. Read your Bible, Maria, and don't talk no more about ghosts. There are ghosts in the Bible, said Maria with a shiver at the recollection of certain awful passages in Scripture she knew so well. Ah, they was in the right place, or they wouldn't have been there, retorted Mrs. Skegg. You ain't going to pick holes in your Bible, I hope, Maria, at your time of life. Maria sat quietly down in her corner by the kitchen fire and turned over the leaves of her dead father's Bible till she came to the chapters they two had loved best and oftenest read together. He had been a simple-minded, straightforward man, a Yarmouth cabinet maker, a man full of aspirations after good, innately refined, instinctively religious. He and his motherless girl had spent their lives alone together in the neat little home which Maria had so soon learned to cherish and beautify. And they had loved each other with an almost romantic love. They had had the same tastes, the same ideas. Very little had sufficed to make them happy. But inexorable death parted father and daughter in one of those sharp, sudden partings which are like the shock of an earthquake, instantaneous ruin, desolation, and despair. Maria's fragile form had bent before the tempest. She had lived through a trouble that might have crushed a stronger nature. Her deep religious convictions and her belief that this cruel parting would not be forever had sustained her. She faced life and its cares and duties with a gentle patience which was the noblest form of courage. Michael Bascom told himself that the servant girl's foolish fancy about the room that had been given her was not a matter of serious consideration. Yet the idea dwelt in his mind unpleasantly and disturbed him at his labours. The exact sciences require the complete power of a man's brain, his utmost attention, and on this particular evening, Michael found that he was only giving his work a part of his attention. The girl's pale face, the girl's tremulous tones thrust themselves into the foreground of his thoughts. He closed his book with a fretful sigh, wheeled his large armchair round to the fire, and gave himself up to contemplation. To attempt study with so disturbed a mind was useless. It was a dull grey evening, early in November. The student's reading lamp was lighted, but the shutters were not yet shut, nor the curtains drawn. He could see the leaden sky outside his windows, the fir tree tops tossing in the angry wind. He could hear the wintry blast whistling amidst the gables before it rushed off seaward with a savage howl that sounded like a war whoop. Michael Bascom shivered and drew nearer the fire. "It's childish, foolish nonsense," he said to himself. "Yet it's strange she should have that fancy about the shadow. For they say Anthony Bascom destroyed himself in that room. I remember hearing it when I was a boy from an old servant whose mother was housekeeper at the great house in Anthony's time. I never heard how he died, poor fellow, whether he poisoned himself or shot himself or cut his throat, but I've been told that that was the room. Old Skeggs heard it too. I could see that by his manner when he told me the girl was to sleep there." He sat for a long time, till the grey of evening outside his study windows changed to the black of night, and the war whoop of the wind died away to a low, complaining murmur. He sat, looking into the fire, and letting his thoughts wander back to the past and the traditions he had heard in his boyhood. That was a sad, foolish story of his great-uncle Anthony Bascom. It's a pitiful story of a wasted fortune and a wasted life. A riotous collegiate career at Cambridge, a racing stable at Newmarket, an imprudent marriage, a dissipated life in London, a runaway wife, an estate forfeited to moneylenders, and then the fateful end. Michael had often heard that dismal story, how when Anthony Bascom's fair, false wife had left him when his credit was exhausted, and his friends had grown tired of him, and all was gone except Wildheath Grange. Anthony, the broken-down man of fashion, had come to that lonely house unexpectedly one night, and had ordered his bed to be got ready for him in the room where he used to sleep when he came to the place for the wild duck shooting in his boyhood. His old blunderbuss was still hanging over the mantelpiece, where he had left it when he came into the property and could afford to buy the newest thing in fowling pieces. He had not been to Wildheath for 15 years, nay, for a good many of those years he had almost forgotten that the dreary old house belonged to him. The woman who had been housekeeper at Bascom Park, till house and lands had passed into the hands of the moneylenders, was at this time the sole occupant of Wildheath. She cooked some supper for her master, and made him as comfortable as she could in the long untenanted dining room, but she was distressed to find, when she cleared the table after he had gone upstairs to bed, that he had eaten hardly anything. Next morning she got his breakfast ready in the same room, which he managed to make brighter and cheerier than it had looked overnight. Brooms, dusting brushes, and a good fire did much to improve the aspect of things. But the morning wore on to noon, and the old housekeeper listened in vain for her master's footfall on the stairs. Noon waned to late afternoon. She had made no attempt to disturb him, thinking that he had worn himself out by a tedious journey on horseback, and that he was sleeping the sleep of exhaustion. But when the brief November day clouded with the first shadows of twilight, the old woman grew seriously alarmed, and went upstairs to her master's door, where she waited in vain for any reply to her repeated calls and knockings. The door was locked on the inside, and the housekeeper was not strong enough to break it open. She rushed downstairs again full of fear, and ran bareheaded out into the lonely road. There was no habitation nearer than the turnpike on the old coach road from which this side road branched off to the sea. There was scanty hope of a chance passer-by. The old woman ran along the road, hardly knowing whither she was going or what she was going to do, but with a vague idea that she must get somebody to help her. Chance favoured her. A cart laden with seaweed came lumbering slowly along from the level line of sands yonder, where the land melted into water. A heavy, lumbering farm labourer walked beside the cart. "For God's sake, come in and burst open my master's door," she entreated, seizing the man by the arm. "He's lying dead or in a fit, and I can't get to help him." "All right, missus," answered the man, as if such an invitation were a matter of daily occurrence. "Whoa, Dobbin! Stand still, horse, and be donged to thee." Dobbin was glad enough to be brought to anchor on the patch of waste grass in front of the Grange garden. His master followed the housekeeper upstairs and shattered the old-fashioned lockbox with one blow of his ponderous fist. The old woman's worst fear was realized. Anthony Bascom was dead. But the mode and manner of his death Michael had never been able to learn. The housekeeper's daughter, who told him the story, was an old woman when he was a boy. She had only shaken her head and looked unutterable things when he questioned her too closely. She had never even admitted that the old squire had committed suicide. Yet the tradition of his self-destruction was rooted in the minds of the natives of Holcroft, and there was a settled belief that his ghost, at certain times and seasons, haunted Wild Heath Grange. Now Michael Bascom was a stern materialist. For him the universe with all its inhabitants was a great machine governed by inexorable laws. To such a man the idea of a ghost was simply absurd. As absurd as the assertion that 2 and 2 make 5, or that a circle can be formed of a straight line. Yet he had a kind of dilettante interest in the idea of a mind which could believe in ghosts. The subject offered an amusing psychological study. This poor little pale girl now had evidently got some supernatural terror into her head, which could only be conquered by rational treatment. I know what I ought to do, Michael Bascom said to himself suddenly. I'll occupy that room myself tonight and demonstrate to this foolish girl that her notion about the shadow is nothing more than a silly fancy, bred of timidity and low spirits. An ounce of proof is better than a pound of argument. If I can prove to her that I have spent a night in the room and seen no such shadow, she will understand what an idle thing superstition is. Daniel came in presently to shut the shutters. Tell your wife to make up my bed in the room where Maria has been sleeping and put her into one of the rooms on the first floor for tonight's gag, said Mr. Bascom. Sir? Mr. Bascom repeated his order. That silly wench has been complaining to you about her room, Skegg exclaimed indignantly. She doesn't deserve to be well fed and cared for in a comfortable home. She ought to go to the workhouse. Don't be angry with the poor girl, Skegg. She has taken a foolish fancy into her head, and I want to show her how silly she is, said Mr. Bascom. And you want to sleep in that room yourself, said the butler. Precisely. Well, mused Skegg, if he does walk, which I don't believe, he was your own flesh and blood. Don't suppose he'll do you any hurt. When Daniel Skegg went back to the kitchen, he railed mercilessly at poor Maria, who sat pale and silent in her corner by the hearth, darning old Mrs. Skegg's grey worsted stockings, which were the roughest and harshest armour that ever human foot clothed itself withal. Was there ever such a whimsical, fine, ladylike miss, demanded Daniel, to come into a gentleman's house and drive him out of his own bedroom to sleep in an attic with her nonsenses and vagaries? If this was the result of being educated above one's station, Daniel declared that he was thankful that he had never got so far in his schooling as to read words of 2 syllables without spelling. Education might be hanged for him if this was all it led to. I'm very sorry, faltered Maria, weeping silently over her work. Indeed, Mr. Skegg, I made no complaint. My master questioned me, and I told him the truth. That was all. All? Exclaimed Mr. Skegg irately. All, indeed. I should think it was enough. Poor Maria held her peace. Her mind, fluttered by Daniel's unkindness, had wandered away from that bleak big kitchen to the lost home of the past, the snug little parlour where she and her father had sat beside the cosy hearth on such a night as this, she with her smart workbox and her plain sewing, he with the newspaper he loved to read, the petted cat purring on the rug, the kettle singing on the bright brass trivet, the tea tray pleasantly suggestive of the most comfortable meal in the day. Oh, those happy nights, that dear companionship. Were they really gone forever, leaving nothing behind them but unkindness and servitude? Michael Bascom retired later than usual that night. He was in the habit of sitting at his books long after every other lamp but his own had been extinguished. The Skeggs had subsided into silence and darkness in their dreary ground-floor bedchamber, Tonight his studies were of a peculiarly interesting kind, and belonged to the order of recreative reading rather than of hard work. He was deep in the history of that mysterious people who had had their dwelling place in the Swiss lakes, and was much exercised by certain speculations and theories about them. The old 8-day clock on the stairs was striking 2 as Michael slowly ascended, candle in hand, to the hitherto unknown region of the attic. At the top of the staircase, he found himself facing a dark, narrow passage which led northwards. A passage that was in itself sufficient to strike terror into a superstitious mind, so black and uncanny did it look. Poor child, mused Mr. Bascom, thinking of Maria. This attic floor is rather dreary, and for a young mind prone to fancies. He had opened the door of the north room by this time and stood looking about him. It was a large room with a ceiling that sloped on one side, but was fairly lofty upon the other, an old-fashioned room, full of old-fashioned furniture, big, ponderous, clumsy, associated with the day that was gone and people that were dead. A walnut-wood wardrobe stared him in the face. A wardrobe with brass handles which gleamed out of the darkness like diabolical eyes. There was a tall 4-post bedstead which had been cut down on one side to accommodate the slope of the ceiling, and which had a misshapen and deformed aspect in consequence. There was an old mahogany bureau that smelt of secrets. There were some heavy old chairs with rush bottoms mouldy with age and much worn. There was a corner washstand with a big basin and a small jug, the odds and ends of past years. Carpet there was none, save a narrow strip beside the bed. It is a dismal room, mused Michael, with the same touch of pity for Maria's weakness which he had felt on the landing just now. To him it mattered nothing where he slept, but having let himself down to a lower level by his interest in the Swiss lake people, he was in a manner humanized by the lightness of his evening's reading, and was even inclined to compassionate the weaknesses of a foolish girl. He went to bed, determined to sleep his soundest. The bed was comfortable, well supplied with blankets, rather luxurious than otherwise, and the scholar had that agreeable sense of fatigue which promises profound and restful slumber. He dropped off to sleep quickly, but woke with a start 10 minutes afterward. What was this consciousness of a burden of care that had awakened him? This sense of all-pervading trouble that weighed upon his spirits and oppressed his heart? This icy horror of some terrible crisis in life through which he must inevitably pass? To him, these feelings were as novel as they were painful. His life had flowed on with smooth and sluggish tide, unbroken by so much as a ripple of sorrow. Yet tonight he felt all the pangs of unavailing remorse, the agonizing memory of a life wasted, the stings and humiliation of disgrace, shame, ruin, a hideous death, which he had doomed himself to die by his own hand. These were the horrors that pressed him round and weighed him down as he lay in Anthony Bascom's room. Yes, even he, the man who could recognize nothing in nature or in nature's God better or higher than an irresponsible and invariable machine governed by mechanical laws, was fain to admit that here he found himself face to face with a psychological mystery. This trouble which came between him and sleep was the trouble that had pursued Anthony Bascom on the last night of his life. So had the suicide felt as he lay in that lonely room, perhaps striving to rest his wearied brain with one last earthly sleep before he passed to the unknown intermediate land where all is darkness and slumber. And that troubled mind had haunted the room ever since. It was not the ghost of the man's body that returned to the spot where he had suffered and perished, but the ghost of his mind, his very self, no meaningless simulacrum of the clothes he wore and the figure that filled them. Michael Bascom was not the man to abandon his high ground of skeptical philosophy without a struggle. He tried his hardest to conquer this oppression that weighed upon mind and sense. Again and again he succeeded in composing himself to sleep, but only to wake again and again to the same torturing thought, the same remorse, the same despair. So the night passed in unutterable weariness, for though he told himself that the trouble was not his trouble, that there was no reality in the burden, no reason for the remorse, these vivid fancies were as painful as realities, and took as strong a hold upon him. The first streak of light crept in at the window, dim and cold and grey. Then came twilight, and he looked at the corner between the wardrobe and the door. Yes, there was the shadow. Not the shadow of the wardrobe only, that was clear enough, but a vague and shapeless something which darkened the dull brown wall, so faint, so shadowy that he could form no conjecture as to its nature or the thing that it represented. He determined to watch this shadow till broad daylight, but the weariness of the night had exhausted him, and before the first dimness of dawn had passed away, he had fallen fast asleep, and was tasting the blessed balm of undisturbed slumber. When he woke, the winter sun was shining in at the lattice, and the room had lost its gloomy aspect. It looked old-fashioned and grey and brown and shabby, but the depth of its gloom had fled with the shadows and the darkness of the night. Mr. Bascom rose refreshed by a sound sleep, which had lasted nearly 3 hours. He remembered the wretched feelings which had gone before that renovating slumber, but he recalled his strange sensations only to despise them, and he despised himself for having attached any importance to them. Indigestion, very likely, he told himself, or perhaps mere fancy engendered of that foolish girl's story. The wisest of us is more under the dominion of imagination than he would care to confess. Well, Maria shall not sleep in this room any more. There is no particular reason why she should, and she shall not be made unhappy to please old Skegg and his wife. When he had dressed himself in his usual leisurely way, Mr. Bascom walked up to the corner where he had seen or imagined the shadow, and examined the spot very carefully. At first sight he could discover nothing of a mysterious character. There was no door in the papered wall, no trace of a door that had been there in the past. There was no trapdoor in the worm-eaten board. There was no dark, ineradicable stain to hint at murder. There was not the faintest suggestion of a secret or a mystery. He looked up at the ceiling. That was sound enough, save for a dirty patch here and there where the rain had blistered it. Yes, there was something, an insignificant thing, yet with a suggestion of grimness which startled him. About a foot below the ceiling, he saw a large iron hook projecting from the wall, just above the spot where he had seen the shadow of a vaguely defined form. He mounted on a chair the better to examine this hook and to understand, if he could, the purpose for which it had been put there. It was old and rusty. It must have been there for many years. Who could have placed it there, and why? It was not the kind of hook upon which one would hang a picture or one's garment. It was placed in an obscure corner. Had Anthony Bascom put it there on the night he died? Or did he find it there, ready for a fatal use? If I were a superstitious man, thought Michael, I should be inclined to believe that Anthony Bascom hung himself from that rusty old hook. "Sleep well, sir?" asked Daniel as he waited upon his master at breakfast. "Admirably," answered Michael, determined not to gratify the man's curiosity. He had always resented the idea that Wildheath Grange was haunted. "Oh, indeed, sir, you were so late that I fancied—" "Late? Yes, I slept so well that I overshot my usual hour for waking. But, by the way, Skegg, as that poor girl objects to the room, let her sleep somewhere else. It can't make any difference to us. And it may make some difference to her." "Ugh," muttered Daniel in his grumpy way. "You didn't see anything queer up there, did you?" "See anything? Of course not." Well then, why should she see things? It's all a silly fiddle-faddle. Never mind. Let her sleep in another room. There ain't another room on the top floor that's dry. Then let her sleep on the floor below. She creeps about quietly enough, poor little timid thing. She won't disturb me. Daniel grunted, and his master understood the grunt to mean obedient assent. But here Mr. Bascom was unhappily mistaken. The proverbial obstinacy of the pig family is as nothing compared with the obstinacy of a cross-grained old man, whose narrow mind has never been illuminated by education. Daniel was beginning to feel jealous of his master's compassionate interest in the orphan girl. She was a sort of gentle, clinging thing that might creep into an elderly bachelor's heart unawares and make herself a comfortable nest there. We shall have fine carryings on, and me and my old woman will be nowhere if I don't put my heel pretty strong upon this nonsense, Daniel muttered to himself as he carried the breakfast tray to the pantry. Maria met him in the passage. "Well, Mr. Skegg, what did my master say?" she asked breathlessly. "Did he see anything strange in the room?" "No, girl, what should he see? He said you were a fool." "Nothing disturbed him, and he slept there peacefully," faltered Maria. "Never slept better in his life." "Now don't you begin to feel ashamed of yourself?" "Yes," she answered meekly. "I'm ashamed of being so full of fancies. I'll go back to my room tonight, Mr. Skegg, if you like, and I'll never complain of it again." "I hope you won't," snapped Skegg. "You've given us trouble enough already." Maria sighed and went about her work in saddest silence. The day wore slowly on, like all other days in that lifeless old house. The scholar sat in his study. Maria moved softly from room to room, sweeping and dusting in the cheerless solitude. The midday sun faded into the grey of afternoon, and evening came down like a blight upon the dull old house. Throughout that day, Maria and her master never met. Anyone who had been so far interested in the girl as to observe her appearance would have seen that she was unusually pale, and that her eyes had a resolute look, as of one who was resolved to face a painful ordeal. She ate hardly anything all day. She was curiously silent. Skegg and his wife put down both these symptoms to temper. "She won't eat and she won't talk," said Daniel to the partner of his joys. "That means sulkiness, and I never allowed sulkiness to master me when I was a young man, when you tried it on me as a young woman, and I'm not going to be conquered by sulkiness in my old age." Bedtime came, and Maria bade the Skeggs a civil good night, and went up to her lonely garret without a murmur. The next morning came, and Mrs. Skegg looked in vain for her patient handmaiden when she wanted Maria's services in preparing the breakfast. "The wench sleeps sound enough this morning," said the old woman. "Go and call her, Daniel. The poor legs can't stand them stairs." "Your poor legs are getting uncommon useless," muttered Daniel testily as he went to do his wife's behest. He knocked at the door and called Maria, once, twice, thrice, many times. But there was no reply. He tried the door and found it locked. He shook the door violently, cold with fear. Then he told himself that the girl had played him a trick. She had stolen away before daybreak and left the door locked to frighten him. But no, this could not be, for he could see the key in the lock when he knelt down and put his eye to the keyhole. The key prevented his seeing into the room. "She's in there laughing in her sleeve at me," he told himself. "But I'll soon be even with her." There was a heavy bar on the staircase, which was intended to secure the shutters of the window that lighted the stairs. It was a detached bar, and always stood in a corner near the window, which it was but rarely employed to fasten. Daniel ran down to the landing and seized upon this massive iron bar, and then ran back to the garret door. One blow from the heavy bar shattered the old lock, which was the same lock that Carter had broken with his strong fist 70 years before. The door flew open, and Daniel went into the attic, which he had chosen for the stranger's bedchamber. Maria was hanging from the hook in the wall. She had contrived to cover her face decently with her handkerchief. She had hanged herself deliberately about an hour before Daniel found her, in the early grey of morning. The doctor, who was summoned from Holcroft, was able to declare the time at which she had slain herself, but there was no one who could say what sudden access of terror had impelled her to the desperate act, or under what slow torture of nervous apprehension her mind had given way. The coroner's jury returned the customary merciful verdict of temporary insanity. The girl's melancholy fate darkened the rest of Michael Bascom's life. He fled from Wildheath Grange as from an accursed spot, and from the Skeggs as from the murderers of a harmless innocent girl. He ended his days at Oxford, where he found the society of congenial minds and the books he loved. But the memory of Maria's sad face and sadder death was his abiding sorrow. Out of that deep shadow, his soul was never lifted. So that was The Shadow in the Corner by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. And it was my second ever trigger warning. I did one on His Beautiful Hands, I think. I'm not really in favour of trigger warnings, in that if they are trigger warnings about cultural issues, about cultural differences, so a story written in the 1890s, they have a different cultural attitude towards meat eating, let's just say, for the sake of argument. I'm not going to issue that. Even, and we know classically, classism, ableism, sexism, misogynism, you're going to find that in those old books, and I think, well, they to me, personally, aren't as existentially threatening as suicide, particularly. I've worked for 20 years in crisis teams with people who are suicidal, and I've worked with their families, and so perhaps I am sensitive to that. So, if you think that I'm overreacting, well, please understand where I'm coming from. Anyway, let's get to talk about Mary Elizabeth Braddon. She was born in 1835 and died in 1915. She died in London, in Soho. I guess it wasn't as seedy as it became, and I don't think it's particularly seedy now, more restaurants and stuff now, but when I lived in London in the kind of 80s, early 90s, yeah, it was seedy. So but that's got nothing to do with the story. So she was one of 3 siblings born to Henry Braddon, a solicitor of Cornish descent, like the Cornish, and Fanny White, who was Irish. When Braddon was just 4 years, it doesn't mean I don't like the Irish either, just got to be careful these days, somebody's going to be hitting the comment section. No, I do love everybody. When Braddon was just 4 years old, her parents separated and she remained with her mother, who instilled in her a love of literature, particularly the works of Dickens, Thackeray and Bulwer Lytton. He wrote a couple of cracking fantasy-horror stories. At the age of 17, Braddon began a career on the stage under the pseudonym Mary Seton, performing mainly in provincial theatres from 1852 to 1859, and in those days that was quite a racy thing for a woman to do. Most actresses were considered little better than women of ill repute. However, she decided to leave the stage in 1860 to pursue writing full-time, following the publication of her first novel, The Octoroon, or The Lily of Louisiana, in 1859. Probably she wouldn't get that published with that title now. Braddon's breakthrough came with the publication of Lady Audley's Secret in 1862, which established her as the queen of sensation in the burgeoning genre of sensation novels. Wilkie Collins was the king of sensation. Her personal life became intertwined with her professional life when she met publisher John Maxwell in 1860. If you're a writer, get together with a publisher. Good planning. They began living. I'm not suggesting that there wasn't an element of romantic love there, in case any of you are tempted to write a comment. Didn't you know that he loved her? Somebody will do that now. They began living together in 1861, although they were unable to marry until 1874 due to Maxwell's first wife being confined to a lunatic asylum. I can see more comments there. He was a beast, all that kind of stuff. If you know about it, yeah, I'm interested in the facts. I'm not interested in your factless outrage, though. But if you do have some facts, or even informed opinions. They're welcome. So we don't know what about his wife, do we? So let's not cast tar and feathers on Mary Elizabeth or Mr. Maxwell until we know. I came across a great meme on the internet which said, practice not having an opinion on subjects about which you are not informed. I thought, do you know what? That would turn the whole internet upside down. And the Olympics, of course, because people who know nothing about curling or figure skating, or I think breakdancing was in it, they will talk about it as if they're experts and criticise the athletes. I've said that somewhere else before. And I quoted my grandfather's statement that, if you begin to dig a hole in the morning, by being doing it an hour, 5 men will have come up and told you that you're doing it wrong and you should do it some other way. And then shortly afterwards you will learn that none of them have ever dug a hole before in their lives. So yeah, people are very keen on delivering their opinions about which they know now. So I'm a bit testy this morning, aren't I? I'm a bit peppery. Anyway, so Braddon, who I love, not in that sense. I don't know her and she's dead. I'm not related to her, so that's okay. Braddon was incredibly prolific, writing over 80 novels as well as plays, essays, short stories and poems. She also edited literary magazines including Temple Bar and Belgravia. Despite facing criticism for the sensational nature of her work, Braddon continued to write prolifically until her death on February 4th, 1915 in Richmond upon Thames. So she was born in Soho and moved a mile or two southwest to Richmond upon Thames. Why, one place is as good as another. I've been travelling around a lot recently and I've come to that conclusion. One place is as good as another, you might as well stop where you are. Her last novel, Mary, was published posthumously in 1916. I've done a couple of Mary Braddon stories now, and one of my faves is The Cold Embrace. For gothic, great stories. I don't know why people don't listen to it. It's one of there are certain stories on the channel that surprise me. Sometimes I do a story and I actually think it's relatively mediocre and it gets loads of views and people love it. And then I do a story which I love, which is The Cold Embrace. Gothic or what? And it's just overlooked. And I think, it's the thumbnail. So I changed the thumbnail. My theory of thumbnails is if it's got a house on it, it will get views. If it's got anything else, it won't. People are weird. Anyway, The Shadow in the Corner is a ghost story written by M.E. Braddon, published in 1879. As you know, it tells the tragic tale of Maria, unaware of the haunting of the house and the terrible incident that had happened there. I thought that she, at the end, when she has Michael Bascom, his descendant, I think it's his great uncle who killed himself, and Michael Bascom, Anthony Bascom, that is, good name, and Michael Bascom, the great-grandnephew, he who now owns it, the man of science, I think she really conjures up the feelings of despair that Anthony Bascom, and she talks about how he's infected with the energy of the room, in a sense. She doesn't use those terms, but I think that's what she's saying. And he kind of gets the vibe of the desperate man and feels something of his despair and desperation. I thought she did that really well. I think the way that she described how he felt was rang true, I suppose. That reminded me of the stone tape theory. So this is a paranormal hypothesis that says that hauntings are due to the stones. And Nigel Neal, who I've done a couple of his stories, did a 1972 and 1972 BBC television play called The Stone Tape. Fantastic. You can get it on YouTube. It's really good. I mean, it's very sort of British 1972. People with sideburns and turtleneck sweaters saying, "Hey, Joan, you're going to the cellar," and things like that. But it's really good. So the theory is, it wasn't his theory, but he popularised it, that certain materials, particularly stone, can absorb and store energy from traumatic or emotionally charged events. So the emotion of a murder or a suicide or anything like that is going to seep into the bricks, the stone particularly. And I've heard people say that something to do with crystals. Honestly, nobody knows, and it's probably made up. But yeah, it is made up, really. But, well, I mean, you know, let's not say that. Maybe in the future somebody will say, no, the truth was there all along, Tony Walker, and you did it down. And you had an opinion about something about which you were not informed, so shut your gob. So anyways, quartz. So sandstone has microcrystals in any, you know, we know kind of crystals. Sheila's got a room full of crystals. She's now become a crystal hunter. We were in Arundel in Sussex a couple of weeks ago, and there was this market there, and there was a lady there selling all sorts of odds and sods. Odds and ends. And she had these rough crystals that weren't polished or anything, and Sheila kind of gave me the nod and the wink. And I got them for a knockdown price, and she went to her friend who commercially sells crystals, and she said, you got some real deals there. Leads me on to another crystal experience. We were coming back from Sussex, and we ended up in Lincoln, and it was Lincoln Market just before the cathedral. Again, if you ever happen to be, if you're thinking about coming to England and you don't know where to go, Arundel on the south coast is definitely worth a visit. So is Lincoln, up in Lincolnshire, a bit further north, about 250, 300 miles further north of Arundel. So we're in this market, and we walk past these guys, and they're an elderly couple who are really nice, and they were coming to the end of their career, and they had a market stall, and they were selling quirky odds and ends. So you got it right that time. And from their stall, all sorts of, you know, weird and wonderful stuff that they'd accumulated. And he was telling me, I'm going to come to the very point about this in a minute, but he was telling me that firms of interior decorators for the great and the good will contact him and ask him for some quirky bits to put in their pads. That's a very 70s word. And so there we are, this massive crystal skull, and turns out it's hand carved, not machine carved, from a block of quartz. And Sheila fell in love with it. She said it spoke to her, she felt its energy. I don't feel any of that stuff. And I thought it was quite good. Apparently Johnny Depp had owned this skull, and because apparently this guy was telling us he was hired to provide items for, I don't know how many flats, houses Johnny Depp has got in London, but one was in Soho, interestingly, and the other was in Kensington, and I think this was in the Soho, and this was probably during his Pirates of the Caribbean, because they were filming in London, so it would make sense for him to have that. But he obviously didn't like it that much, and it's downstairs with us now. It cost an arm and a leg, man. But she reckons it's worth twice. So it is a crystal. See how I've segued back into stone tape theory? We've got some of Johnny Depp's vibe in our house, for better or for worse. I have no... everybody's controversial these days. I don't know the guy. He's never done anything to me, and I thought I quite like his acting. And I don't know whether he's good or bad, but I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. And so the vibes may be okay. Somebody will comment, no, he's an evil man, how dare you, I'm unsubscribing. Yeah, I am peppery today. So anyway, stone tape theory. So, my little note says, it's a pseudo-scientific theory, not accepted in mainstream science. Don't let us get on to Rupert Sheldrake's ideas of morphic resonance, which I like. You are a... Oh, no, here we go again. There's more comments on it. He is a charlatan, a fraud, and you, by giving credence to his ideas, are spreading evil in the world. Somebody actually accused me of being an agent of the New World Order. I haven't even met them. I don't know who they are. And if I'm their agent, they're not paying me anything. So, if anybody's listening from the New World Order, can you pay me what you owe me, please? This guy was called something, his handle, again I sound like somebody from a CB radio, Rubber Duck, we've got us a convoy, and he was called something like Johnny Smoked Crack. That was his YouTube name, and I'm like, I think you've been smoking crack. I get some interesting comments. I could do a whole chat about the various comments, the unpleasant, the ludicrous, the insane, and then I could do one about the helpful ones and the nice ones, and there are many, many more of those, but they're not as interesting enough. I mean, keep doing them. But if you are a bit insane, just write an insane comment just to make me laugh. Okay, where were we? We were talking about Maria. We were talking about Anthony Bascom. And I've said before about, and I think Braddon does this really well. I mean, I've said this before as well. If you want to be good at doing something, just do it a lot. If you want to be good at making sales, make a lot of sales. If you want to be good at playing chess or flying an aeroplane, if you want to be good at writing, write. And these professional writers, Mary Elizabeth Braddon in this case, they write, and they just write so nicely. And I can tell that because I don't stumble so much over the words. The language flows, you know, and I don't have to do 1,000 million takes, which with some people I do. And I think also there's something about writers who have an ear for who could recite the work, and others such as Faulkner and Henry James who write for the eye. They don't write for the ear, you know. But Braddon, the working writers, you know, and Henry James was a working writer, but this last, she churned them out, and she writes for the ear, I think. Anyway, High Victorian period, hyper-rational. So we talk about, and this is a quote. Now, Michael Bascom was a stern materialist. For him, the universe, with all its inhabitants, was a great machine, governed by inexorable laws. To such a man, the idea of a ghost was simply absurd as the assertion that 2 and 2 make 5, or that a circle can be formed a straight line. So this is she's making fun of him. Also, I don't know if you remember The Phantom Coach by Charlotte Riddell, Amelia B. Edwards, and that is in this era as well, and they come across this alchemist guy and the Moors, and so you have there's that two cultures idea. We won't get into that really, because that was between the scientific and the artistic, but certainly there has been the rational from the Enlightenment, which is quantifying the world, is taking the world and making a map of it with numbers and diagrams and taking that as the real world. And then there's the romantic, which I guess I fall into. I have a bit of the rational, which is about saying, you know, that the world is not a map, the world is not a representation, the map is not territory, as Alfred Korzybski said. But, so the romantic emphasizes that natural flow that makes us grow, makes our hair grow, makes us grow older and younger and stronger, you know, obviously not in that order, and gives us life, versus the dry and dusty mechanical view. And of course in the Victorian age that was tops, but there was a reaction to it, you know. Wordsworth and the Romantics and Schiller and all these people reacted against that, and the Gothic is that reaction, you know, that against, in a hyper-real, hyper-scientific world, the Gothic literature flourished because we want, look at now, you know, the Harry Potter and thing. I mean, okay, that's maybe a bit dated, but we turn to fantasy, we turn against rationality because it has dried up our world. And that reminds me of this guy called John Matthews, him and his wife Kathleen Matthews. They write about Celtic stuff, druidry and the bards, and King Arthur as well, particularly John Matthews. And I remember reading in one of his books about King Arthur the stories of the well maidens, and so these were nymphs or spirits who lived in the land and were responsible for making it fruitful. And the knights in their hubris, if you can personify this rationalistic logos, this male analytical thinking, you know, women think like that, but it is typically characterized as a male approach. These knights in their hubris and arrogance kill probably rape them as well, the well maidens, and therefore the land becomes barren. And that is behind T.S. Eliot's play The Wasteland. The land is the wasteland, it is the wounded fisher king, and all this lovely Arthurian stuff. So that, in a sense, symbolizes how our analytical brain can disenchant us from the world, can make the world dead, really. We live in it, but we think a blind mechanism. It's old Richard Dawkins is the blind watchmaker, isn't it? And I'm not for that really. If we're talking about that, and this is probably one of my favourite subjects, it's there's a guy called Max Weber, a German sociologist, who brought up the concept of the disenchantment of the world, I think in German, Entzauberung. So yeah, Zauber is sorcery, isn't it? To describe a key aspect of modernization in Western society. So Weber's views were that the increasing rationalization, where traditional and magical elements are replaced by scientific, bureaucratic and technological systems, disenchanted, and we lose mystery, magic and wonder as scientific explanations replace religious or spiritual ones. And he sees that coming as being, I don't think he sees it as a good thing. He talks about of an iron cage, how the rationalization and bureaucratization can trap individuals in systems of efficiency and control, limiting their freedom and creativity. Now, there's another guy called Paul Kingsnorth, who is a writer. He just recently converted to the Greek Orthodoxy, or Orthodoxy, maybe Russian Orthodoxy, after being kind of, very much. He wrote a book called Real England, which I loved. Talking about this, how we've sold ourselves, everything to the machine, which is basically bleeding us dry and not giving us any spiritual sustenance. That's why you listen to these stories, because you don't go out on a limb and say, because you're hungry for wonder and awe. And it's related to Nietzsche's idea. I read recently The Joyous Science, so it's translated differently, but that's the famous quote about God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe its blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred game shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Probably I like it all up to that last sentence. So Nietzsche's also talking about this disenchantment that I've talked about, the King Arthur's knights killing the nymphs of the wells, Weber's idea of the disenchantment of the world. We lived before the Enlightenment, we lived in this world that was soaked in meaning and spirit, and our rationalization has basically killed us and led to epidemics of depression and unhappiness and disconnect from the land. The world is dead. So in this view, it's just a dead machine. So we can do what we want to it. We don't have to relate to it as a person or as an organism. We can just it's just a commodity, and we can use it as a commodity and use it up. And it's led to all of these things now. You think I'm saying, let's go back to being cave people and peasant farmers. I'm not actually saying that. I'm going to introduce a concept of a word which is really hard for me to say. So, enantidromia, which is a Jungian idea. So, what this says is that things swing to their opposites. So, Jung had this idea that whatever's conscious will be counterbalanced by its opposite on the unconscious. So, if we are a very masculine man on the exterior, we'll have interior, we will have a feminine side, and all sorts of things. And so, logos, the rational, versus eros, the relational, which we would characterize as female. We lived in a hyper male world of rationality, and things swing to their opposites. You cannot suppress them. So on the surface we have this rational, technological, mechanistic, analytical world. I'm just reading, actually, funnily enough, still reading Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary. I'm going to take it to Scotland with me because he lives on the Isle of Skye. I don't think we'll call him, but he's another great thinker, I think, and he's saying the same thing pretty much about, and he talks about in the hemispheres of the brain that one is this analytical that sees things in parts and the other is more holistic. But going back to Jung's and antidromia, what you have is things switch. So I am not saying technology is wrong. I'm not, or bad. Here I am, I've got clothes. I'm talking to a microphone. But if one thing becomes preponderant, that's a word? Preponders? No, that's not a word. Then the opposite will surge up. And you can argue that, I'll bet you off a word. And actually, I'm not even, I have a preference for the romantic and the mystical. But I do like the rational as well. I love apps and productivity apps and Tana and Hectorbase and all of these things. I love them, and technology. But I also like mystical as well. Maybe so. We have all of these things in us, and if one becomes too strong, then the other will rise up from the unconscious. And I think, at the risk of getting 1 million comments, we lived in a masculine world. It's a man's world, as James Brown said. But and he said it, but without a woman, I can't remember the words, but And now what we're seeing is a feminization of the world, including all the yeah, maybe not, but we are less certain of our gender identity than we were. I mean, individuals. This is what's going to get the comment. Individuals have a different view on that. I mean, I think I know what I am. But all I'm saying is, it's like a natural process. It's like the tide coming in. It's like the day and the night. If we can step back from it and remove any kind of shoulds and oughts and goods and bads, we can just see that the pendulum will swing both ways. I've gone a long way from Bratton, but I think she was poking fun at Baskin. Let's kind of get back to the story. So what we have is the young female girl who is sensitive to these things, who is sensitive to the suffering of the man who killed himself. Now, he was an awful old money waster, but still, that's a heck of a price to pay for that. And she feels it, whereas the skegs who are kind of drudges and they have confined themselves down to a very small part of the house. They live a very small life, and they just reject anything that isn't part of that small life. Maria is much more open, sensitively and emotionally. Bascom has shut off his emotional side completely, and represents this technological dude. And even he goes to the room and he can't bear it, and that melts him, and we see some kindness coming up. There is kindness in him, and he doesn't want Maria to suffer, and he's haunted by her death for the rest of his life. We know that. He is just not able. He tries to make it right and get her put in another room, but the skegs who live like they're shut down automata, really, aren't they? They're coarsened. They've lost their sensitivity in every sense. They have no curiosity, no sensitivity. They live a world bound by very concrete and constricting rules. And it is a very small world. And because she has an education, they don't like that, because she's aspired. She should be like them. She's aspired to more. And they punish her for that, and ultimately they don't kill her, but they sort of do. And I think Michael Bascom recognises that. So we've had a bit of a runaround thinking-wise. It's amazing what you can get out of a story. We talked about the stone tape theory. We talked about, the death of God, and what that means for our society as we become increasingly secularized. And remember, I'm not saying that religiosity is the answer, and I'm not saying that secularization is the answer. What I'm saying is that if one rises, the other will come up after it, So there we are. I hope you enjoyed that. It was a good story. I hope you enjoyed my chat. Please let me know. Walnut Tree House, a ghost story. Written by Charlotte Riddell. Published in 1878. 1. The New Owner. Many years ago, there stood at the corner of a street leading out of Upper Kennington Lane a great red brick mansion, which, one very wet evening, in an autumn the leaves of which have been long dead and gone, looked more than ordinarily desolate and deserted. There was not a sign of life about it. For 7 years no one had been found to live in it. For 7 years it had remained empty, while its owner wore out existence in fits of moody dejection or of wild frenzy in the madhouse close at hand. And now that owner was dead and buried and forgotten, and the new owner was returning to take possession. This new owner had written to his lawyers, or rather he had written to the lawyers of his late relative, begging them to request the person in charge of the house to have rooms prepared for his arrival. And when the train drew into the station, he was met by one of Messrs. Timpson & Co. clerks, who, picking out Mr. Stainton, delivered to that gentleman a letter from the firm, and said he would wait to hear if there were any message in reply. Mr. Stainton read the letter, looked at the blank flyleaf, and then, turning back to the first words, read what his solicitors had to say all through once again. Said the new owner, after he had finished. "I'll go and take a look at the place anyhow. Is it far from here, do you know?" he asked, turning to the young man from Timpson's. "No, sir, not very far." "Can you spare time to go over there with me?" inquired Mr. Stainton. The young man believed that he could, adding, "If you want to go into the house, we'd better call for the key. It's at an estate agent's in the Westminster Bridge Road." "I cannot say I have any great passion for hotels," remarked the new owner as he took his seat in the cab. "Indeed, sir?" "No, either they don't suit me, or I don't suit them. I've led a wild sort of life, not much civilization in the bush or at the goldfields, I can tell you. Then I've not been well, and I can't stand noise and the trampling of feet. I had enough of that on board ship, and I used to lie awake at nights and think how pleasant it would be to have a big house all to myself, to do as I liked in." "Yes, sir," agreed the clerk. "You see, I've been accustomed to roughing it, and I can get along very well for a night without servants. No doubt, sir. I suppose the house is in substantial repair, roof tight and all that sort of thing?" "I can't say, I'm sure, sir." "Well, if there's a dry corner where I can spread a rug, I shall sleep there tonight." The clerk coughed. He looked out of the window, and then he looked at Messrs. Timpson's client. "I do not think," he began apologetically, and then stopped. "You don't think what?" asked the other. "You'll excuse me, sir, but I really do not think, if I were you, I'd stay in that house tonight." "Why not?" "Well, it hasn't been slept in for nearly 7 years, and it must be blue mouldy with damp, and if you've been ill, that's all the more reason you shouldn't run such a risk, and besides..." "Besides?" suggested Mr. Stainton. "Out with it." No doubt that "besides" holds the marrow of the argument. "The house has stood empty for years, sir, because there's no use making any secret of it. The place has a bad name." "What sort of a bad name? Unhealthy?" "Oh, no. Haunted." The clerk inclined his head. "You've hit it, sir," he said. "And that is the reason no one's lived there. We have been quite unable to let the house on that account." "The sooner it gets unhaunted, then, the better," retorted Mr. Stainton. "I shall certainly stop there tonight. You're not disposed to stay and keep me company, I suppose?" With a little gesture of dismay, the clerk drew back. Certainly this was one of the most unconventional of clients. The young man from Timpson's did not at all know what to make of him. "A rough sort of fellow," he said afterwards when describing the new owner. "Boorish, never mixed with good society, that sort of thing." He did not in the least understand this rich man who treated him as an equal, who objected to hotels, who didn't mind taking up his abode in a house where not even a drunken charwoman could be induced to stop, and who calmly asked the stranger, on whom he had never set eyes before, a clerk in the respectable office of Timpson & Co., a young fellow anxious to rise in the world, careful as to his associates, particular about the whiteness of his shirts and the set of his collar and the cut of his coats, to rough things with him in that dreadful old dungeon where perhaps he mightn't even be expected to light a fire. Still, he didn't wish to offend the new owner. Messrs. Timpsons anticipated he would be a profitable client, and to that impartial firm the money of a boor would, he knew, seem as good as the money of a count. "I'm very sorry," he stammered. "Should only have felt too much honoured, but the fact is, previous engagement." Mr. Stainton laughed. "I understand," he said. "Adventures are quite as much out of your line as ghosts. And now, tell me about this apparition. Does the old man walk?" "Not that I ever heard of," answered the other. "Is it then the miserable beggar who tried to do for himself?" "It is not the late Mr. Stainton, I believe," said the young man in a tone which mildly suggested that reference to a client of Timpson's as a miserable beggar might be considered bad taste. "Then who on earth is it?" persisted Mr. Stainton. "If you must know, sir, it is a child who has driven every tenant in succession out of the house." The new owner burst into a hearty laugh, a laugh which gave serious offence to Timpson's clerk. "That is too good a joke," said Mr. Stainton. "I do not know when I heard anything so delicious." "It is a fact, whether it be delicious or not," retorted the young man, driven out of all his former propriety of voice and demeanour by the contemptuous ridicule this digger thought fit to cast on his story. "And I, for one, would not, after all I have heard about your house, pass a night in it. No, not if anybody offered me £50 down." "Make your mind easy, my friend," said the new owner quietly. "I'm not going to bid for your company. The child and I can manage, I'll be bound, to get on very comfortably by ourselves." 2. The child. It was later on the same evening. Mr. Stainton had an hour previously taken possession of Walnut Tree House, bidden Timpson's clerk good evening, and having ordered in wood and coals from the nearest greengrocer, he now stood by the front gate, waiting the coming of the goods purchased. As he waited, he looked up at the house, which, in the uncertain light of the street lamps, appeared gloomier and darker than had been the case even in the gathering twilight. "It has an uncanny look, certainly," he considered. "But once I can get a good fire up, I should be all right. Now, I wonder when those coals are coming." As he turned once again towards the road, he beheld on its way the sack of fuel with which the nearest greengrocer said he thought he could, indeed said he would, oblige him. A ton, half a ton, quarter of a ton, the greengrocer affirmed would be impossible until the next day. But a sack? Yes, he would promise that. Bill should bring it round, and Bill was told to put his burden on the truck and 12 bundles of wood. "And we'll make up the rest tomorrow," added Bill's master with the air of one who has conferred a favour. In the distance, Mr. Stainton described a very grimy Bill, and a very small boy coming along with the truck leisurely, as though the load had been Herculean. Through the rain, he watched the pair advancing, and greeted Bill with a glad voice of welcome. "So you've come at last. That's right. Better late than never. Bring them this way. I'll have this small lot shot in the kitchen for the night." "Begging your pardon, sir," answered Bill, "I don't think you will. That is to say, not by me. As I told our governor, I'll take them to the house as you've sold them to the house, but I won't set foot inside it." "Do you mean to say that you're going to leave them out on the pavement?" asked Mr. Stainton. "Well, sir, I don't mind taking them to the front door, if that'll be a convenience." "That'll do. You're a brave lot of people in these parts, I must say." "As for that," retorted Bill with the sack on back and head bent forward, "I dare say we're as brave about here as where you come from." "It's not impossible," retorted Mr. Stainton. "There are plenty of cowards over there too." After he had shot his coals on the margin of the steps, Bill retreated from the door, which stood partly open. And when the boy who brought up the wood was again out with the truck, said, putting his knuckles to his eyebrows, "Beg pardon, sir, but I suppose you wouldn't give me a drop of beer. Very wet night, sir." "No, I would not," answered Mr. Stainton very decidedly. "I shall have to shovel these coals into the house myself, and as for the night, it's as wet for me as it is for you." Nevertheless, as Bill shuffled along the short drive, shuffling wearily, like a man who, having nearly finished one day's hard work, was looking forward to beginning another hard day in the morning, the new owner relented. "Here," he said, picking out a sixpence to give to him. "It isn't your fault, I suppose, that you believe in old women's tales." "Thank you kindly, sir," Bill answered. "I'm sure I'm extremely obliged, but if I was in your shoes, I wouldn't stop in that house. You excuse me, sir, meaning no offence, but I wouldn't. Indeed, I would not." "It seems to have got a good name at any rate," thought Mr. Stainton, while retracing his steps to the band tenement. "Let us see what effect a fire will have in routing the shadows." He entered the house and, striking a match, lighted some candles he brought in with him from a neighbouring oil shop. After an inspection of the ground floor rooms, he decided to take up his quarters for the night in one which had evidently served as a library. In the centre of the apartment there was the table covered with leather. Around the walls were bookcases. In one corner stood a bureau, where the man who for so many years had been dead even while living kept his letters and papers. He ate his frugal supper, and then, pushing aside the table on which the remains of his repast were spread, began walking slowly up and down the room, thinking over the past and forming plans for the future. Buried in reflection, the fire began to die down without his noticing the fact. But a feeling of chilliness at length causing him instinctively to look towards the hearth, he threw wood into the grate, and while the flames went blazing up the wide chimney, piled on coals as though he desired to set the house alight. While he was so engaged, there came a knock at the door of the room, a feeble, hesitating knock, which was repeated more than once before it attracted Mr. Stainton's attention. When it did, being still busy with the fire and forgetting he was alone in the house, he called out, "Come in!" Along the panels there stole a rustling sort of touch, as if someone were feeling uncertainly for the handle. A curious noise, as of a weak hand fumbling about the door in the dark. Then, in similar manner, the person seeking admittance tried to turn the lock. "Come in, can't you?" repeated Mr. Stainton. But even as he spoke, he remembered he was, or ought to be, the sole occupant of the mansion. He was not alarmed. He was too much accustomed to solitude and danger for that. But he rose from his stooping position and instinctively seized his revolver, which he had chanced, while unpacking some of his effects, to place on the top of the bureau. "Come in, whoever you are," he cried. But seeing the door still remained closed, though the intruder was evidently making futile efforts to open it, he strode halfway across the room and then stopped, amazed. For suddenly the door opened, and there entered, shyly and timidly, a little child. A child with the saddest face mortal ever beheld. A child with wistful eyes and long, ill-kept hair. A child poorly dressed, wasted and worn, and with the mournfullest expression on its countenance that face of child ever wore. "What a hungry-looking little beggar," thought Mr. Stainton. "Well, young one, and what do you want here?" he added aloud. The boy never answered, never took the slightest notice of his questioner, but simply walked slowly round the room, peering into all the corners as if looking for something, searching the embrasures of the windows, examining the recesses beside the fireplace, pausing on the hearth to glance under the library table, and finally, when the doorway was reached once more, turning round to survey the contents of the apartment with an eager and yet hopeless scrutiny. "What is it you want, my boy?" asked Mr. Stainton, glancing as he spoke at the child's poor thin legs and short shabby frock and shoes well-nigh worn out and arms bare and lean and unbeautiful. "Is it anything I can get for you?" Not a word, not a whisper, only for reply a glance at the wistful brown eyes. "Where do you come from, and whom do you belong to?" persisted Mr. Stainton. The child turned slowly away. "Come, you shall not get off so easily as you seem to imagine," persisted the new owner, advancing towards his visitor. "You have no business to be here at all, and before you go, you must tell me how you chanced to be in this house, and what you expected to find in this room." He was close to the doorway by this time, and the child stood on the threshold with its back towards him. Mr. Stainton could see every detail of the boy's attire, his little plaid frock, the hooks which fastened it, the pinafore, soiled and crumpled, tied behind with strings broken and knotted. In one place the skirt had given from the bodice, and a piece of thin, poor flannel showed that the child's under-habiliment matched in shabbiness his exterior garments. "Poor little chap," thought Mr. Stainton. "I wonder if he'd like something to eat. Are you hungry, my lad?" The child turned and looked at him earnestly, but answered never a word. "I wonder if he is dumb," marvelled Mr. Stainton, and seeing he was moving away, put out a hand to detain him. But the child eluded his touch and flitted into the hall and up the wide staircase with swift, noiseless feet. Only waiting to snatch a candle from one of the sconces, Mr. Stainton pursued as fast as he could follow. Up the easy steps he ran at the top of his speed, but fast as he went, the child went faster. Higher and higher he beheld the tiny creature mounting, then, still keeping the same distance between them, it turned when it reached the top story and trotted along a narrow corridor with rooms opening off to right and left. At the extreme end of this passage a door stood ajar. Through this the child passed, Mr. Stainton still following. "I have run you to earth at last," he said, entering and closing the door. "Why, where's the boy gone?" he added, holding the candle above his head and gazing round the dingy garret in which he found himself. The room was quite empty. He examined it closely, but could find no possible outlet save the door and a skylight which had evidently not been opened for years. There was no furniture in the apartment, except a truckle bedstead, a rush-bottomed chair, and a rickety washstand. No wardrobe or box or press, where even a kitten might have lain concealed. "It's very strange," muttered Mr. Stainton, as he turned away baffled. "Very strange," he repeated, while he walked along the corridor. "I don't understand it at all," he decided, proceeding slowly down the topmost flight of stairs. But there, all at once, he stopped. "It's the child!" he exclaimed aloud, and the sound of his own voice woke strange echoes through the silence of that desolate house. "It is the child!" And he descended the principal staircase very slowly, with bowed head, and his grave, worn face graver and more thoughtful than ever. 3. Searching for information. It was enough to make any man look grave, and as time went on, the new owner of Walnut Tree House found himself pondering continually as to what the mystery could be which attached to the child he had found in possession of his property, and who had already driven tenant after tenant out of the premises. Inclined at first to regard the clerk's story as a joke, and his own experience on the night of his arrival a delusion, it was impossible for him to continue incredulous when he found, even in broad daylight, that terrible child stealing down the staircase and entering the rooms, looking for something it never found. At bed and at board he had company, or the expectation of it. No apartment in the building was secure from intrusion. It did not matter where he lay. It did not matter where he ate. Between sleeping and waking, between breakfast and dinner, whenever the notion seized it, the child came gliding in, looking, and never finding. Not lingering longer than was necessary to be certain the object of its search was absent, but wandering hither and thither, from garret to kitchen, from parlour to bedchamber, in that quest which still seemed fresh as when first begun. Mr. Stainton went to his solicitors, as the most likely persons from whom to obtain information on the subject, and plunged at once into the matter. "Who is the child supposed to be, Mr. Timpson?" he asked, making no secret that he had seen it. "Well, that's really very difficult to say," answered Mr. Timpson. "There was a child once, I suppose, a real child, flesh and blood." Mr. Timpson took off his spectacles and wiped them. "There were two, yes, certainly, in the time of Mr. Felix Stainton, a boy and a girl. In that house? In that house. They survived him. And what became of them? The girl was adopted by a relation of her father's, and the boy died." "Oh, the boy died, did he? Do you happen to know what he died of?" "No, I really do not. There was nothing wrong about the affair, however, if that's what you're thinking of. There never was a hint of that sort." Mr. Stainton sat silent for a minute. Then he said, "Mr. Timpson, I cannot shake off the idea that somehow there has been foul play with regard to those children. Who were they?" "Felix Stainton's grandchildren. His daughter made a low marriage, and he cast her adrift. After her death, the two children were received at Walnut Tree House on sufferance, fed and clothed, I believe, that was all. And when the old man died, the heir at law permitted them to remain. Alfred Stainton. Yes, the unhappy man who became insane. His uncle died intestate, and he consequently succeeded to everything but the personality, which was very small, and of which the children had a share. There never was any suspicion, you say, of foul play on the part of the late owner?" Dear, no, quite the contrary." "Then you cannot throw the least light on the mystery?" "Not in the least. I wish I could." For all that, Mr. Stainton carried away an impression Mr. Timpson knew more of the matter than he cared to tell. "There's a mystery behind it all," he considered. "I must learn more about these children. Perhaps some of the local tradespeople may recollect them." But the local tradespeople, for the most part, were newcomers, or else had not supplied the house. "There's only one person I can think of, sir," said one family butcher, "likely to be able to give you any information about the matter." "And that is?" "Mr. Hennings at the Pedlar's Arms. He had some acquaintance with the old lady as was housekeeper, both to Mr. Felix Stainton and a gentleman that went out of his mind." Following which advice, the new owner repaired to the Pedlar's Arms. "Do I know Walnut Tree House, sir?" said Mr. Hennings, repeating his visitor's question. "Well, yes, rather." "Well, you might as well ask me, do I know the Pedlar's Arms? As boy and man, I can remember the old house for close on 55 years. I remember Mr. George Stainton. He used to wear a skull cap and knee breeches. There was an orchard then where Stainton Street is now, and his whole day was taken up in keeping the boys out of it. Many a time I've run from him." "Did you ever see anything of the boy and girl who were there after Mr. Alfred succeeded to the property? Felix Stainton's grandchildren, I mean," asked the new owner, when a pause in Mr. Hennings' reminiscences enabled him to take his part in the conversation. "Well, sir, I may have seen the girl, but I can't bring it to my recollection. The boy I do remember, however. He come over here 2 or 3 times with Mrs. Topless, who kept house for both Mr. Staintons, and I took notice of him, both because he looked so peaky and old-fashioned, and also on account of the talk about him." "There was talk about him, then?" "Bless you, sir, yes. As much talk while he was living as since he died. Everybody thought he ought to be the heir. But if you want to hear all about him, sir, Mr. Topless is the one to tell you. If you have a mind to give a shilling to a poor old lady who always did to try to keep herself respectable, and who, I will say, paid her way honourable as long as she had a sixpence to pay it honourable with, you cannot do better than to go and see Mrs. Topless, who will talk to you for hours about the time she lived at Walnut Tree House. And with this delicate hint that his minutes were more valuable than the days of Mrs. Topless, Mr. Hennings would have closed the interview, but that his visitor asked where he should be able to find the housekeeper. 1,000 pardons, answered the publican with an air, forgetting the very cream and marrow of it, wasn't I? Mrs. Topless, sir, is to be found in Lambeth Workhouse, and a pity too. Edgar Stainton turned away, heartsick. Was this all wealth had done for his people and those connected with them? 4. Brother and sister. Mr. Stainton had expected to find Mrs. Topless a decrepit crone, bowed with age and racked with rheumatism, and it was therefore like a gleam of sunshine streaming across his path to behold a woman, elderly certainly, but carrying her years with ease, ruddy-cheeked, clear-eyed, upright as a dart, who welcomed him with respectful enthusiasm. "And so you are Mr. Edgar, the son of the dear old captain," she said, after the first greetings and explanations were over, after she had wiped her eyes and uttered many ejaculations of astonishment and expressions of delight. "Hey, I remember him coming to the house just after he was married and telling me about the dear lady, his wife. I never heard a gentleman speak so proud. He never seemed tired of saying the words, 'my wife.'" "She was a dear lady," answered the new owner. "And so the house has come to you, sir. Well, I wish you joy. I hope you may have peace and health and happiness and prosperity in it, and I don't see why you should not. No, indeed, sir." Edgar Stainton sat silent for a minute, thinking how he should best approach his subject. "Mrs. Topless," at last he began, plunging into the very middle of the difficulty, "I want you to tell me all about it. I have come here on purpose to ask you what it all means." The old woman covered her face with her hands, and he could see that she trembled violently. You need not be afraid to speak openly to me," he went on. "I'm quite satisfied there was some great wrong done in the house, and I want to put it right, if it lies in my power to do so. I am a rich man. I was rich when the news of this inheritance reached me, and I would gladly give up the property tomorrow if I could only undo whatever may have been done amiss." Mrs. Topless shook her head. "Ah, sir, you can't do that," she said. "Money can't bring back the dead to life, and if it could, I doubt if even you would prove as good a friend to the poor child sleeping in the churchyard yonder as his Maker did when he took him out of this troublesome world. It was just soul-rending to see the boy in the last few months of his life. I can't bear to think of it, sir. Often at night I wake in a fright, fancying I still hear the patter-patter of his poor little feet upon the stair. Do you know, it's a curious thing, but he doesn't frighten me," said Mr. Stainton. "That is, when I am in the house. Although, when I am away from it, the recollection seems to dog every step I take." "What?" cried Mrs. Topless. "Have you then seen him too? There, what am I talking about? I hope, sir, you will forgive my foolishness." "I see him constantly," was the calm reply. "I wonder what it means. I wonder what it can mean," exclaimed the housekeeper, wringing her hands in dire perplexity and dismay. "I do not know," answered the new owner philosophically, "but I want you to help me find out. I suppose you remember the children coming there at first?" "Well, sir, well. They were poor Miss Mary's son and daughter. She ran away, you know, with a Mr. Fenton, made a very bad match, but I believe he was kind to her. When they were brought to us, a shivering little pair, my master was for sending them here. Aye, and he would have done it too, if somebody hadn't said he could be made to pay for their keep. You never saw brother and sister so fond of one another. Never. They were twins, but law, he was more like a father to the little girl than aught else. He'd have kept an apple a month rather than eat it unless she had half, and the same with all else. I think it was seeing that, watching the love they had, he for her and she for him, coming upon them unsuspected with their little arms round one another's necks, made the old gentleman alter his mind about leaving the place to Mr. Alfred. For he said to me one day, thoughtful-like, pointing to them, "Wonderful fond topless." And I answered, "Yes, sir, for all the world like the babes in the wood," not thinking of how lonely that meant. Shortly afterwards, he took to his bed, and while he was lying there, no doubt, better thoughts came to him, for he used to talk about his wife and Miss Mary and the captain, your father, sir, and ask if the children were gone to bed and such like, things he never used to mention before. So when he made the will, Mr. Quinance drew up, I was not surprised, no, well, not one bit, though before that time he always spoke of Mr. Alfred as his heir and treated him as such. That will was never found, suggested Mr. Stainton, anxious to get at another portion of the narrative. Never, sir. We hunted for it high and low. Perhaps I wronged him, but I always thought Mr. Alfred knew what became of it. After the old gentleman's death, the children were treated shameful. I don't mean beaten or such like, but half starved and neglected. He wouldn't buy them proper clothes, and he wouldn't suffer them to wear decent things if anybody else bought them. It's just the same with their food. I durstn't give them even a bit of bread and butter unless it was on the sly, and indeed there was not much to give in that house. He turned regular miser. Hoarding came into the family with Mrs. Lancelot Stainton, Mr. Alfred's great-grandmother, and they went on from bad to worse, each one closer and nearer than the last. Begging your pardon for saying so, sir, but it's the truth. I fear so, Mrs. Topless, agreed the man, who certainly was neither close nor near. Well, sir, at last, when the little girl was about 6 years old, she fell sick, and we didn't think she would get over the illness. While she was about at her worst, Mrs. May, her father's sister, chanced to be stopping up in London, and as Mr. Alfred refused to let a doctor inside his doors, she made no more ado but wrapped the child up in blankets, sent for a cab, and carried her off to her own lodgings. Mr. Alfred made no objection to that. All he said as she went through the hall was, "If you take her now, remember, you must keep her." "Very well," she replied, "I will keep her." "And the boy," cried Mr. Stainton in an agony of impatience. "I'm coming to him, sir, if you please. He just dwined away after his sister and he were parted, and died in December, as she was taken in the July." "What did he die of?" "Broken heart, sir. Seems a queer thing to say about a child, but if ever a heart was broken, his was. At first he was always going about the house looking for her, but towards the end he used to go up to his room and stay there all by himself. At last I wrote to Mrs. May, but she was ill when the letter got to her, and when she did come up he was dead. My word, she talked to Mr. Alfred. I never heard any one person say so much to another. She declared he had first cheated the boy of his inheritance and then starved him to death, but that wasn't true. The child broke his heart fretting after his sister." "Yes, and when he was dead?" "Sir, I don't like to speak of it, but as true as I am sitting here, the night he was put in his coffin, he come pattering down just as usual, looking for his sister. I went straight upstairs, and if I hadn't seen a little wasted body lying still and quiet, I must have thought he'd come back to life. We were never without him afterwards, never. That, and nothing else, drove Mr. Alfred mad. He used to think he was fighting the child and killing it. When the worst fits were on him, he tried to trample it underfoot or crush it up in a corner, and then he would sob and cry and pray for it to be taken away. I have heard he recovered a little before he died, and said his uncle told him there was a will leaving all to the boy, but he never saw such a paper. Perhaps it was only talk, though, or that he was still raving. 5. The next afternoon. Mr. Stainton was trying to work off some portion of his perplexities by pruning the grimy evergreens in front of Walnut Tree House and chopping away at the undergrowth of weeds and couch grass which had, in the course of years, matted together beneath the shrubs, when his attention was attracted to two ladies who stood outside the great iron gate looking up at the house. "Seems to be occupied now," remarked the elder, turning to her companion. I suppose the new owner's going to live there. It appears just as dingy as ever, but you do not remember it, Mary. I think I do, is the answer. As I look, the place grows familiar to me. I do recollect some of the rooms, I'm sure, just like a dream, as I remember Georgie. What I would give to have a peep inside. At this juncture, the new owner emerged from amongst the bushes and, opening the gate, asked if the ladies would like to look over the place. The elder hesitated, whilst the younger whispered, "Oh, Aunt, pray do." "Thank you," said Mrs. May to the stranger, whom she believed to be a gardener, "but perhaps Mr. Stainton might object." "No, he wouldn't, I know," declared the new owner. "You can go through the house if you wish. There's no one in it. Nobody lives there except myself." "Taking charge, I suppose," suggested Mrs. May blandly. "Something of the sort," he answered. "I don't think he is a caretaker," said the girl, as she and her relative passed into the old house together. "What do you suppose he is, then?" asked the aunt. "Mr. Stainton himself." "Nonsense, child!" exclaimed Mrs. May, turning nevertheless to one of the windows, and casting a curious glance towards the new owner, who was now, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, walking idly up and down the drive. After they had been all over the place, from hall to garret, with a peep into this room and a glance into that, Mrs. May found the man who puzzled her leaning against one of the pillars of the porch, waiting, apparently, for their reappearance. "I'm sure we are very much obliged to you," she began with a certain hesitation in her manner. "Pray don't mention it," he said. "This young lady has sad associations connected with the house," Mrs. May proceeded, still doubtfully feeling her way. He turned his eyes towards the girl for a moment, and though her veil was down, saw she had been weeping. "I surmised as much," she replied. "She is Miss Fenton, is she not?" "Yes, certainly," was the answer. "And you are—" "Edgar Stainton," said the new owner, holding out his hand. "I'm all alone here," he explained, after the first explanations were over. "But I can manage to give you a cup of tea. Pray do come in, and let me feel I'm not entirely alone in England." Only too well pleased, Mrs. May complied, and 10 minutes later the three were sitting round a fire, the blaze of which leapt and flickered upon the walls and over the ceiling, casting bright lights on the dingy mirrors and the dark oak shelves. "It's all coming back to me now," said the girl softly, addressing her aunt. "Many an hour Georgie and I have sat on that hearth seeing pictures in the fire." But she didn't see something which was even then standing close beside her, and which the new owner had witnessed approach with a feeling of terror that precluded speech. It was the child searching about no longer for something it failed to find, but standing at the girl's side, still and motionless, with its eyes fixed upon her face and its poor wasted figure nestling amongst the folds of her dress. "Thank heaven she doesn't see it," he thought, and drew his breath, relieved. No, she did not see it, though its one cheek touched her shoulder, though its thin hand rested on her arm, though through the long conversation which followed, it never moved from her side, nor turned its wistful eyes from her face. When she went away, when she took her fresh young beauty out of the house, her presence seemed to gladden and light up. The child followed her to the threshold, and then, in an instant, it vanished, and Mr. Stainton watched for its flitting up the staircase, all in vain. But later on in the evening, when he was sitting alone beside the fire, with his eyes bent on the glowing coals, and perhaps seeing pictures there, as Mary said she and her brother had done in their lonely childhood, he felt conscious, even without looking around, that the boy was there once again. And when he fell to thinking of the long, long years during which the dead child had kept faithful and weary watch for his sister, searching through the empty rooms for one who never came, and then bethought him of the sister to whom her dead brother had become but the vaguest of memories, of the summers and winters during the course of which she had probably forgotten him altogether, he sighed deeply. He heard his sigh echoed behind him in the merest, faintest whisper. More when he, thinking about his newly found relative and trying to recall each feature in her face, each tone of her voice, found it impossible to dissociate the girl grown to womanhood from the child he had pictured to himself, as wandering about the old house in company with her twin brother, their arms twined together, their thoughts one, their sorrows one, their poor pleasures one. He felt a touch on his hand and knew the boy was beside him, looking with wistful eyes into the firelight too. But when he turned, he saw that sadness clouded those eyes no longer. She was found. The lost had come again to meet a living friend on the once desolate hearth, and up and down the wide, desolate staircase those weary little feet pattered no more. The quest was over. The search ended. Into the darksome corners of that dreary house the child's glance peered no longer. She was come. Through years he had kept faithful watch for her, but the waiting was ended now. 6. The missing will. Ere long there were changes in the old house. Once again Mrs. Topless reigned there, but this time with servants under her, with maids she could scold and lads she could harass. The larder was well plenished, the cellars sufficiently stocked, windows formerly closely shuttered now stood open to admit the air, and on the drive grass grew no longer. Too many footsteps passed that way for weeds to flourish. It was Christmas time. The joints in the butcher's shops were gay with ribbons. The grocer's windows were tricked out to delight the eyes of the children, young and old, who passed along. In Mr. May's house up the Clapham Road all was excitement, for the whole of the family, father, mother, grown-up sons and daughters, girls still in short frocks and boys in round jackets, were going to spend Christmas Eve with their newly found cousin, whom they had adopted as a relation with a unanimity as rare as charming. Cousin Mary also was going. Cousin Mary had got a new dress for the occasion, was having her hair done up in a specially effective manner by Chrissy May, when the toilette proceedings were interrupted by half a dozen young voices announcing, "Gentleman in the parlour wants to see you, Mary. Pa says you to make haste and come down immediately." Obediently, Mary made haste as bidden and descended to the parlour, to find there the clerk from Timpson's, who met Mr. Stainton on his arrival in London. His business was simple but important. Once again he was the bearer of a letter from Timpson & Co., this time announcing to Miss Fenton that the will of Mr. Felix Stainton had been found, and that under it she was entitled to the interest of £10,000 secured upon the houses in Stainton Street. "Oh, Aunt, oh, Uncle, how rich we shall be!" cried the girl, running off to tell her cousins. But the uncle and aunt looked grave. They were wondering how this will might affect Edgar Stainton. While they were still talking it over, after Timpson's young man had taken his departure, Mr. Edgar Stainton himself arrived. "That's all right," he said in answer to their questions. "I found the will in the room where Felix Stainton died. Walnut Tree House and all the freeholds were left to the poor little chap who died, chargeable with Mary's £10,000, 500 to Mrs. Topless and a few other legacies. Failing George, the property was to come to me. I have been to Quinance's successor and found out that the old man and Alfred had a grievous quarrel, and that in consequence he determined to cut him off altogether. Where's Mary? I want to wish her joy." Mary was in the little conservatory searching for a rose to put in her pretty brown hair. He went straight to her and said, "Mary dear, you've had one Christmas gift tonight, and I want you to take another with it." "What is it, Cousin Edgar?" she asked. But when she looked in his face, she must have guessed his meaning, for she drooped her head and began pulling her sweet rose to pieces. He took the flower, and with it her fingers. "Will you have me, dear?" he asked. "I am but a rough fellow, but I am true, and I love you dearly." Somehow she answered him as she wished, and they all spent a very happy evening in the old house. Once, when he was standing close beside her in the familiar room, hand clasped in hand, Edgar Stainton saw the child looking at them. There was no sorrow or yearning in his eyes as he gazed, only a great peace. a calm which seemed to fill and light them up with an exquisite beauty.
Everybody dies. It's funny how that is. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the loft door today, didn't you?
They'll come back.
So that was The Walnut Tree House by Charlotte Riddell. The first thing I need to do is to thank Ed W for sponsoring this episode. He reached out to me via Ko-fi, where you can actually commission me to do stories if you want to. And he suggested I do this story. So he is the sponsor, he's the official sponsor. If I knew his second name, can't remember it now. So Ed W, thank you very much. I will send you a message, but this might be the first thing you hear is like me thanking you. So thank you. Okay. Also, the second thing I need to say is I've been trying to wait for the scrap man to finish scrapping, but his business is, he's doing a roaring trade at the moment, and he never stops scrapping. And so if you hear this sound like an angry drill, you know the dentist drill, the really big ones that go, when they make your bones shake, and they go through the floorboards, then if you can hear that's him. I was going to wait for him, but my work schedule is too punishing. I can't afford to wait. So I'm going to say something about Charlotte Riddell. Now, is it Charlotte Riddell or Charlotte Riddle? When I was younger, I was in the Territorial Army, and we had a sergeant called Sergeant Riddell, who was spelt like this. And he was from Fife, I want to say, so he was a Scotsman. And although she was Irish from Antrim, given the part of Ireland she's from, and what I also know about her, I reckon she's one of the plantation Scots who came over from the southwest of Scotland. I think Riddell is potentially a Scottish name. Is it Riddell or Riddle? Don't know. I think I'm going to go with Riddell. He always wanted to be called Riddell because we used to call him Riddle, as in Jimmy Riddle, just because we didn't like him. He wasn't very nice. But anyway, that's got nothing to do with this story, apart from he may be related to her. Charlotte Riddell, born 1832 in County Antrim, in the north of Ireland, or Northern Ireland, was a prolific and well-respected. Those who know will know what I did there. You know me, I'm always trying not to offend people. Was a prolific and well-respected novelist and short story writer of the Victorian era, known as the novelist of the city for her insightful portrayals of London's business world. Riddell moved to London in her early 20s following her father's death, hoping to support herself and her mother through writing. Ambitious, and most people who have that don't make it, but she did, which is a reason for trying it, because it might be you who makes it. Anyway, her early years in London were challenging, I bet they were, but she persevered, publishing her first novels under various pseudonyms. In 1857, how old was she then? 25. She married Joseph Hadley Riddell. Oh yeah, okay, so she's called Cowan, so take it all back. I was at school with some Cowans. You know what it knew as Couch, that was his nickname. In 1857, I'm going to keep on messaging. She married Joseph Hadley Riddell, a civil engineer whose poor business acumen often left the couple in financial straits. But she must have loved him, compelling Charlotte to maintain a rigorous writing schedule to support them both, yet like my own. Riddell's breakthrough came with her 1864 novel George Geeth of Fen Court, which established her reputation as a chronicler of London's financial district. Over a 4-decade career, she published more than 40 novels, edited 2 periodicals, and wrote numerous short stories. While she gained fame for her novels about business and professional life, Riddell is best remembered today for her ghost stories, which are considered one of the finest of the Victorian era. I've got thoughts about this. Despite her earlier success, Riddell's work fell out of fashion in the 1890s, leading to financial difficulties in her later years, because she died in 1906, so she had 16 years to live being unpopular. I've lived many decades being unpopular, so I can sympathise with her. She became the first recipient of a pension from the Society of Authors in 1901, but her final years were marked by ill health. Passed away in London, 1906. In 1861, talk about the magazines. She was co-proprietor and editor of the St. James's magazine. Let's say something about the Walnut Tree story. You find the notes. If I was handy, I would have them in it. I wouldn't have to say. It's my notes. They would be there, and they are there. So click on them there. It was published in 1878. A quintessential example of Victorian ghost fiction. Now we know the story, so we're not going to repeat that. What I think it's important to realise is that Riddell was the equivalent of, you know, when you go in the airport and there are certain authors who are on the shelves. They're on the shelves for a reason, because they write compelling stories that people want to buy. How about that? Oh, that's right. She was that. Many of the stories, and this isn't me being a snob, he said snobbishly, but they are really competent, but they're not literature as such. What do you mean by literature? Two things I think when I come to literature are prose style. Now, for a lot of people, they don't care about prose style, but remember, I was a poet first, a really bad one, but I used to love poetry when I was a kid, so I've always had an ear for the style of the writer. That's not the main thing. The main thing is literature looks at the human condition, so it speaks to people across the decades and centuries. Because so Shakespeare, and I'm not very familiar with the Latin authors, but people, I know they didn't particularly write fiction, but some of the early fictional authors, they're saying things that we resonate with us. Whereas probably genre fiction, which I love science fiction, I love fantasy, ghost stories, detective stories, and they are entertaining, they're compelling, you turn the pages, but at the end you haven't probably learned anything much about the human condition. Certain people, potentially people like Henry James, whatever, and Edith Wharton, I think, Shirley Jackson, they can potentially, Robert Aickman, I think, maybe, yeah, okay, they can do both. They can actually write a ghost story that teaches you about the human condition, but in the era of the Victorian period, when the ghost story was exploding, they were the equivalent of your police procedurals and your spy stories and your, I don't really read romance, but equivalents of the romance versions that you find on the shelf. They are for middle-brow, that sounds middle-brow. They're for middle-brow people. They are popular novels, is what I'm laboriously trying to say. The genre occupies, and my notes say, the genre occupies a space between highbrow literary works, which we've been talking about, and lowbrow sensational fiction. We've done on the Ghost podcast, we've done Varney the Vampire, for example. And I know Jasper Lestrange did Sweeney Todd, so go and listen to that. And that was the sensationalist lowbrow, if you like. What is the difference? I just said about the human condition, which is highbrow stuff. She doesn't not do that, because in this story we talk about certain, there is at least allusions to economic and social conditions that aren't not there. You know what I mean? They're there deliberately. If we look at the plot devices, the concept of a cheated inheritance was a big deal in Victorian fiction. So it is a common trope, reflecting the era's preoccupation with social status and financial security. The presence of orphaned or mistreated children in the narrative, it echoes similar themes worked by Charles Dickens and other social reformers of the time. Literature can be used for social reform. This idea of the virtuous man restoring order to a troubled house is another Victorian trope, embodying the period's ideas of moral rectitude and social responsibility. This theme is often intertwined with the idea of righting past wrongs, a common narrative in Victorian fiction. It resonated with the era's sense of social justice, again, and accountability in all senses. The inclusion of a romantic subplot and happy ending aligns with Victorian literary conventions, satisfying the reader's expectations for emotional resolution and poetic justice. We think of A Christmas Carol, how the ghost, it's another supernatural story, it talks about social issues and ends up nicely, and the ghost has had a part in that. The ghost is agentless in this, other than, no, I think it's not actually, I'm just going to contradict myself. It doesn't have any active agency itself, just wanders around looking for its sister, or his sister, Georgie, the ghost. Let's call him his name. But if it hadn't been for the ghost, Stainton. So Stainton comes in, there's a parallelism, isn't there? He inherits the old house, which is in a bit of a state, and he spends his time putting it right. That's like symbolic for him righting the wrongs of his past. It's the family's house which has fallen to rack and ruin, such as the family's moral state has fallen to rack and ruin by its miserliness, which is hinted at but also it's the guy who went mad. Of course, that's his punishment for cheating the twins and sending the young girl away and allowing the young boy Georgie to die of a broken heart. He is punished. So it's a very moral story, and bad guys get their just rewards or their unjust rewards. You know what I mean? They get punished. And the good guys, in the end, everything comes right. So the classic Victorian story. I don't know if you've ever read The Quincunx by, what's his name, Charles Palliser, which is a pastiche of the Victorian story. It's about, you could kill a man with it, you could throw it at him and kill him. It's that big a book. But it's a fantastic book, a real page-turner. That's all about cheated inheritances and the righting of wrongs. It's sort of very well-done pastiche of Victorian literature. This period, so we're talking about late 19th century, the last two-thirds of the 19th century. The ghost story evolved from the Gothic horror, the Castle of Otranto and the Mysteries of Udolpho and all that stuff in the 18th and early 19th century. And they were set in foreign places with foreign noblemen who you couldn't trust, of course, you can't trust foreigners, and they still think that. And in exotic places, Le Fanu, I believe I was listening to a program and they seemed to know him and they knew the family. I always thought it was Le Fanu, but it's Le Fanu they were calling it, so that's what I'm going to do now. So his Carmilla set in Carinthia. Later on, of course, I'm jumping ahead, but Dracula is a kind of Gothic throwback. It's set in Transylvania. These stories, the classic Gothics, were set in Italy and on the continent amongst the Bulgarian bandits and brigands and things like that. So when we get this story, we've got the Gothic elements of the haunted house and the ghost and the cheated family, inheritance, again, very Gothic tropes, but they're in a London street. So it's like domesticization, I think I just made that word up, or the modernisation for that time of traditional Gothic tropes. The pathetic children's whole studies of work about this. But in the Victorian period, if you remember, the idea of a childhood is a relatively new idea because basically with animals, you don't get a childhood, you're little and you play around. As soon as you can, work, you work. And there is no childhood or adolescence or teenage years. You work. And that development of childhood sort of happened. The childhood is an epoch in the Victorian period. And so they came to idolise the child, probably because children were so mistreated, growing up working in factories, growing up cotton mills, and the industrialisation perhaps brought that to the eyes of more people, or the conscience of more people, whereas in the old days, when it was in the rural areas before the industrialisation, it still went on. But in any case, the Victorians, I was going to say the word fetishised. What I mean is they made a big deal of childhood, and because the child became to them sacred. You think of all those Victorian prayer books and hymn books with little cupids and little idyllic looking. No, Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. It was a great Victorian hymn. Look upon this little child. Pity. No, I can't remember what else. Anyway, that's a bad sign. I used to know that off by heart. Oh no, been doing too many ghost stories. This idea of the child and the fetishization of the child is seen here. He's pathetic and he's innocent. Children are pathetic and innocent. I think Dickens does that a bit, but he possibly does it a bit better because we have the Artful Dodger as well. All right. So he's pitiful. This ghost is not a scary ghost. Yet he still has the role of the traditional ghost, which is to right wrongs, which is to be the harbinger of the righting of wrongs, to bring wrongs to the notice of good people who then go and do the work. So look at Hamlet's ghost, Hamlet's father's ghost, not Hamlet's ghost. Although Hamlet presumably didn't have a ghost, that's another play that didn't get put on. That's that really. Let's have a think about it. Well, look at the structure. It's just really well constructed. Key narrative techniques typical of Victorian storytelling, particularly in structure and pacing. It employs a gradual revelation structure popular in Victorian literature, which is really in common with with detective stories as well. There is a mystery. Who is the child? It's like a detective story, isn't it? And how does he find out? He goes to one person, who tells him a bit, He goes to another person who tells him a bit more, and you get all these characters adding their bits of various sources: the lawyer, the housekeeper, Mrs. Toffers and local residents, the butcher. The multi-perspective approach adds depth and credibility to the narrative, while also allowing Riddell to reveal information at a controlled pace. So it's revealing at a controlled pace. It's more interesting in that we get different characterizations, and with each person. I'm reading a detective story by Peter James at the moment, because I've got a gig interviewing him, a big crime writer, and I'm going through it, and I'm noticing that he has scenes where more could be revealed, but he doesn't reveal it. He could have given the whole game away, couldn't he, just at the beginning? You know, any crime writer or this story could have said, this is what happened, boom, and 3 paragraphs and you're done. I say sometimes when people send me stories, and my common piece of advice is milk it, draw it out. People don't give the audience everything they want straight away, or else you don't have a story. And people like being teased a bit, not too much. And this is what she does with this technique. And so my notes that I made also say the Victorian fondness for embedded narratives. So as characters recount past events, these become stories within the main story, creating a rich tapestry of interconnected tales. It provides background information, but adds texture, different voices, different scenes. It adds, that's a D word, it adds texture. And yeah, so I think there are commonalities with the growing popularity of the detective story. And yeah, we talked about the domestication of the supernatural. The Gothic ghost rattles chains and is very scary. And the modern ghost is particularly horrible as well. But in this Victorian period, they're domestic. They're not really scary. They have the role of a ghost, as I've said, righting wrongs or bringing wrongs to people's attention. But they're not scary, which they were before and they have become since. Yeah, and the resolution of the ghost's unrest through the reunification, albeit symbolic, with his sister, further emphasizes this domestic approach. The supernatural is not vanquished through exorcism or violence, which would be our modern way of doing it, but through the restoration of family ties and social justice. That is really important. Okay. There are, in terms of the social critique, it's not explicit. It's embedded in the story. It's subtle. It's probably reminding the readers, or at least a society. I've said also many times, the function of fiction, function of stories from the very beginning is to reinforce social conduct, the codes of conduct. Stories tell us how we should behave, and we're taking them in. When I talked about how the bad guy gets punished and the good guy wins, or the good girl wins, we know that's not how the world works, but we want it to work that way. And we try and we strive, some of us, not the bad ones, strive for it to work that way. And that is because we've taken all these stories on board about how the world should be, and this is how it should be. And so this story turns out how it should be. The wicked are punished and the good are rewarded, even though much delayed. And in that, it's a massively Victorian idea. Yeah, so the social critique talks about class, family, doing the right thing, economic injustice, but not in a big way, I don't think. I think she gives just enough to be palatable to her generally lower middle class audience who know what it's like to be on the edge of being poor, but certainly don't want to give all their money away, and who would, to the poor who are all around them. But the Victorians did have a sense of social justice, and that's they go and work in the slums and help people. And this comes from Christianity. I was just reading an article about how, despite what we may think, all of our social norms are underpinned by our Christian heritage in the West. That isn't to say that people are bad, but the thing why we think we should do things, often you can trace it back to our Christian culture. And I'm not making a point about other people's religions, and I can only talk about my own culture, and that's what I'm doing. Because to do otherwise would be wrong. I would be talking out of my hat, wouldn't I? So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that story. Thank you, Ed W., for suggesting it. I thought it was a lovely workmanlike story that is bound to have delighted many of us because we still believe in the moral messages of the story that right should prevail and that good people can bring right about. How about that?